Chapter 9.
Here we are in the midst of a damned siege, and what does our French ally propose? A costume ball.
Captain Barclay, I must remind you of the lack of politeness in your language. He reacted as a husband sick of being pulled up, which he was, both figuratively and physically, for he had to cease pacing to respond.
Surely, madam, it does not signify in the privacy of our own quarters.
Emily spoke firmly, but was careful in her tone, trying not to sound shrewish. It is a habit, sir, and one that will spill out in polite society. I will not, of course, refer to my own feelings on the matter.
Humbugged, thought Ralph Barclay, for in the face of that invocation there was naught to do but apologize. Though it was a mumbled one, he felt retained a little of his dignity. There was resentment, too, and another occasion to wonder if his notion of bringing her to sea with him had been wise. That it had saved expense seemed less of a pressing reason now he had some prize money coming, both from what had happened off Brittany and the recapture of a merchant ship he had effected on the way to Toulon. Even so, it took no great exercise of memory to recall how strapped he had been on taking up this command. Already in debt, he had had to incur more to show even a half-decent fist of the requirements that went with his rank. What really offended him was the change in his young wife. Both at home in Somerset and on coming aboard, she had been meekness itself, deferring to him in all things, as was right and proper in a marriage. Yet that had not lasted, and he could date her first act of defiance to the day he had punished Pearce, and it had not been private rebellion, but a very public one. What he did not know was how Emily saw the same events, saw that her much older husband craved her good opinion, and from such a discovery she had found the means to make more even their relationship. He was even less aware of the thoughts which had intruded to trouble Emily recently, and given the depth of concern that such musings engendered, it was her intention that he should never know. "You are scowling, husband," she said. "I do hope that I am not the cause." "Of course not," he lied. "I was thinking sitting here in the inner harbour is a tedious duty. I think I must ask the Admiral for something more active."
It was an inadvertent thought, yet there, nevertheless, Emily would welcome such a thing, and to cover her embarrassment she said quickly, "If there is to be a costume ball, we must look to what we have in the way of attire." "My inclination is to decline to attend, sir. I fear at a ball and in drink some idiot will say something and I will be obliged to react."
"You cannot hide away, Pearce," insisted Digby. "You must face those who would condescend to you and force them into acknowledgment."
"They resent my rank, and, for all I know, my person."
"Then you must remind them that you are commissioned by the King, and if they would like it, you are quite prepared to write to His Majesty and list their objections. That should shut them up."
Wondering at Digby's persistence, Pearce was gifted with a revelation. His commanding officer did not want to go on his own. He, too, felt he would be badly treated by other officers, especially lieutenants with longer commissions than his own.
"If you wish me to hold your hand, sir—" "Hold my hand?" Digby barked, so fulsomely that Pearce knew he was right. "I need no one to do that, sir."
"We must take Harbin and Fairmallow along with us.
It will do them good to experience polite society."
Digby laughed.
"God knows what it will do for polite society to be exposed to that pair." It might be called a costume ball, but for most naval officers that extended no further than a small face mask. Lord Hood and Admiral Sir William Hotham eschewed even that, and seemed to be quite embarrassed at the way Rear Admiral de Trogoff had got himself up as a Roman emperor. In all, the French officers took the matter of dress more seriously, while the other trait they exhibited was a certain abstemiousness when it came to food and drink. The British officers and mids were never far from a punch-bowl or a platter, and Pearce, watching the behaviour of both, was amused at the quite obvious difference in national habits. "Drink up, Pearce," said
a red-faced and sweating Digby, his voice raised over the nearby music.
You're supposed to be here to enjoy yourself."
Tempted to reply that guzzling was not a prerequisite of pleasure, Pearce decided it would be inappropriate, sank what he had in his cup, and was persuaded to take a refill. But having done so, he detached himself from Digby and his ilk, and as he made his way amongst the French officers, all dressed in some form of costume, he regretted not having done likewise. The whiff of Paris was again strong, surrounded as he was by people speaking French, as well as the behaviour and the dress. For all the fervour of the Revolution, it had to be noted, as a nation these people took their entertainment seriously. While never having experienced Parisian life before the year 91, he guessed that such masques and balls had changed little from monarchical times. With his fellow officers, the object seemed to be to get drunk. With the French, it was dalliance, each lady present surrounded by suitors, most respectful, some deadly serious in their attempts at seduction.
"Lieutenant Pearce, you look to me in some kind of study."
Captain Dambert was wearing a very florid and feathered hat of the 17th century period, and a tabard over breeches and boots that had on it a large blue cross, the blade at his side kept short for decoration. He could hardly be said to look martial, given his age and shape, but he did look striking. "I was just observing, Monsieur le Baron, the differing natures of our two nations. I fear my fellows lack the refinement of your own."
"It is as well that you did not see the place prior to our conjoining. We had as many of that type in our navy, which was hard to swallow. But then, the British navy is open to all, whereas under the Bourbons, commissions were really the preserve of the well-connected. Yet there were stout fighters and good sailors amongst them. I believe you are to escort those who refuse to serve back to their ports."
"I am."
"Then observe them well, Lieutenant Pearce, and might I also say, watch them closely."
Pearce was looking across the room to where Emily Barclay stood, barely visible, surrounded as she was by Frenchmen. That was another difference in temperament. No British officer would so openly display admiration in the presence of her husband. Their host suffered from no such constraints. If a woman was beautiful, and she was that in her milkmaid's outfit, then paying court to her was an obligation as well as a pleasure. The slight disturbance behind her took his eye, and he saw a bunch of midshipmen facing up to an equal number of French youths, who would mostly be the sons of the locals. Knowing how the mids thirsted for a fight wherever they were, and guessing that the Provençal character was equally contentious, he decided to intervene. So he made his way across the room, passing as he did so Emily Barclay and those paying court to her. That also allowed him to see Ralph Barclay deep in conversation with Elphinstone, though his eyes were on his wife, and even in a mask it was plain he was displeased.
"Mr. Harbin, what's afoot here?"
Harbin was drunk, and a quick look at the others present showed them to be in a like state. Those they confronted were not, but since the mids were armed with their dirks, it was reasonable to suppose their opponents were likewise equipped. It would not do anything for Toulonnais-British relations if they fought each other. Someone was almost certain to be seriously wounded.
"They insulted the king, sir,"
Harbin slurred.
"Said he could keep his head as it weren't worth the chopping off." "This was said to you in English?"
"No, sir," said another midshipman, equally inebriated.
"Not one of the buggers speaks like a man should. It's all heathen tongue." "Might I remind you, young man, it is their tongue, and if you do not understand it, I am at a loss to know how you can say with such certainty that they insulted the king."
Pearce was also wondering at the reaction, or lack of it, of his fellow officers. He could not have been the only one to see the possibility of a confrontation, yet they were so intent on drinking and eating that they seemed content to let it pass. He went over to the sullen-looking group of local youths, and addressing them in French, asked them what was amiss, holding up his hand, given they all seemed to want to speak at once, pointing to one of the tallest to extract an explanation. Garbled as it was clearly a case of misinterpretation. They had not said what was supposed. Just as clearly, faced with a bunch of equally belligerent youths, their honour was at stake, and they were not going to back down.
Admonishing them to do nothing, Pearce went over to where Elphinstone stood, which forced Ralph Barclay to move away.
"Sir, I fear we may have an outbreak of violence."
"You mean the shavers, laddie?"
Elphinstone replied, indicating the knot of still agitated mids. When Pearce nodded, he just laughed.
"Happens all the time, Pearce. You'll never stop young men strutting. The only way I have ever found is to pack them off to a whorehouse so they can work off their energy on a mall. There will be sair heeds come the morn."
"Then might I suggest, sir, that we relieve them of their dirks?" Elphinstone was quite shocked at the idea.
"What, and leave them with no defence?"
Plainly he would get nowhere with a man like Elphinstone, so he went back and called to Fairmallow and Harbin.
"Both of you, if you get into trouble tonight, I will masthead you for a week, as well as stretch you and have you kiss the gunner's daughter every day for the same length of time."
It was fortunate that some of the local adults had also seen what was brewing. They were shepherding their youth to the other side of the room, so that the promised trouble seemed to abate, so the clutch of mids went back to drinking. Crossing back to where he had set out, he inadvertently caught Emily Barclay's eye, and it was the devil in him that took him towards and not past her, displacing, with the effect of his arrival, the Frenchman paying her court.
"Mrs. Barclay," he said with a bow.
"Mr. Pearce." He laughed.
"I am so pleased you talk to me as a civilian. I must say I'm uncomfortable still at being addressed by my rank."
"I find it hard to see you as other than the person I first observed."
"I fear you saw me in some straits."
Pearce had not intended to refer to her husband, but he had done so merely with those words, which brought a very bonny touch of rouge to her cheeks. He felt again the attraction he had experienced on first seeing her, that reinforced every time he had witnessed her forays onto the deck of HMS Brilliant. "I fear it would do little good, sir, for me to apologize."
"I cannot see what you have to say sorry for."
"I sense a kindness in that response, which is unwarranted. I fear I was the cause of my husband's displeasure."
"Madam, I was the cause of my own misfortune. How could I observe you and not wish to engage you in conversation?"
The fan she was carrying waved violently. "Sir, you are too bold."
Pearce smiled. "I think our French friends have been somewhat more so."
Suddenly animated, she was lovelier than ever. "They are, sir, to the point of rudeness. Some of the allusions they made were bordering on the obscene." The look of shock on her face was stunning, and had Pearce wishing they were somewhere else. The poor girl did not know that the outre compliments to which she had been subjected were normal in French society, and it was a habit he had absorbed when seeking to make advances to women in Paris. Since they were as prepared to accept them as he was to press them, he had, as a handsome, well-set youth, enjoyed great success, even acquiring in Amélie Labordière a mistress of high social standing and great beauty. That was what Emily Barclay would have enjoyed had she been French. Her husband, like Amelie's, would have exceeded and got on with his own affairs, but provincial English life did not extend to such things. London, perhaps. Out in the country, no.
Their compliments were well-intentioned, I do assure you."
The fan was violent again. "I cannot see it as so, sir."
"It is the nature of the country."
"Then I can see why.
If they cannot control their tongues in polite conversation, they are so enthralled to revolution."
Pearce burst out laughing, loud enough to turn what few heads had not been surreptitiously observing the exchange between him and the wife of his known enemy. Lutyens appeared out of nowhere, and taking his arm, paid Emily a passing compliment and forcibly led him away. "What are you trying to do, Pearce? Alienate every fellow Briton in the room?"
"I cannot imagine what you mean."
"Then you are a fool. How can you pay court to a fellow officer's wife and have any hope of gaining their respect?"
"You mistake my position, Heinrich. I neither need nor desire their respect."
"Yet you wish for their judgment. Who do you think will sit on the board of court-martial that examines your case against Barclay?" Seeing doubt in Pearce's eye, Lutyens continued with some feeling. "Precisely. The very people who are in the room. What they think of you does matter to you and your friends, so do not commit the sin, a cardinal one in the eyes of those present, of openly admiring Emily."
Emily, I see you are familiar enough to name her so. Am I encroaching on your preserve? I do not deny, Pearce, that I have harboured stimulating thoughts in that area. Who could not with such a creature? But that is all they are and all they will remain. I recommend you do the same. That will be a cruel fate. I cannot believe that old sod of a husband satisfies her as she should be. Emily Barclay needs a man between her thighs, not a doddering tyrant. In being so outspoken, Pearce realized that he was slightly affected by the drink he had consumed. Fortunately, Lutyens was not offended, in fact responded with a thin smile. I suspect you are trying to shock me, Pearce, but you are wasting your time. Recall my profession. The sudden commotion from across the room took the attention of both, but only Pearce moved, glad to see that finally some of his fellow lieutenants did likewise. It was dangerous getting between the two sets of belligerents, with the midshipmen wielding their dirks and the locals with knives of all shapes and sizes. There were a lot of theatrical threats with those weapons, but Pearce knew it was only a matter of moments before one was used, and seriously, so he buffeted around the ear the first midshipman he came across, then started to lay into the others, belabouring right and left and bellowing orders to belay. Harbin was on his knees, blood dripping from his head, Fairmelow standing above him, dirk out, and pointed to protect the boy from further harm. "What happened, Fairmelow?" "A cut to the head, sir. One of those frog swine sneaked up and slashed him." "Get him out of here. Mr. Lutyens is over yonder. Move." To the sound of a rondo from the orchestra, lieutenants were wrestling drunken mids, trying to get them away from their opponents, while adults dressed in everything from togas to Red Indian headdress were struggling to do the same to the local boys. To Pearce only one thing worked, a sound punch, and he laid into his side with gusto. Out of the corner of his eye he saw Elphinstone laughing so heartily he was having to hold his sides, clearly enjoying the spectacle. And when some peace had finally been restored, he went over to remonstrate, which got him a rebuke. "Have a care, laddie. You're not rank enough to take me to task." "I do think it could have been stopped, sir." "Then you show your ignorance, Pearce. I was a mid once, and I cannot think of a ball or amusement that did not end up in a spat with someone. I have had fights from Lisbon to Calcutta, with one or two thrown in on the North American station before that war, and I have never served at home that a night in the taverns did not end up in riot. Boys will be boys, and we cannot expect them to stand up to round shot and musket if they will no stand up for themselves at a bash like this. Now, if I were you, I'd find some French fancy and ask her to dance." Pearce looked at the floor area set aside for dancing, not yet full, and the temptation to cross over and ask Emily Barclay to step out with him was strong. But her husband was close to her, and judging by the way he was leaning over and addressing her, he was not pleased. "You have embarrassed me in front of every officer in the room, Mrs. Barclay." "I have done no such thing," Emily pleaded. "Lieutenant Pearce approached me. What would you have me do, turn my back?" "Just that, which would tell all here that you hold him in the same regard as I do. The man is an impostor, a damned revolutionary, and don't you dare remonstrate with me for my language." "Keep your voice down, husband. You are making a spectacle of yourself." Barclay hissed at her. "It is you who have made the spectacle." Emily lost her temper then, something she had never completely done with her husband, but she was not going to stand still to be publicly accused of unbecoming behaviour. "I dare say you would like to punish me as you punished him, and with the same want of justice." "I punished him to protect your honour, madam." "Claptrap, sir. You punished him for your own pride. And tell me, sir, what instructions you gave to my nephew regarding Pearce and his companions when they sailed for England." "Instructions?" "Yes, husband. I was in the cabin when you and Toby were conversing on the poop. What has that boy done, sir, on your orders, that makes him fear retribution from John Pearce?" "That is naval business and none of your concern. I think now also that it is time we return to the ship." "You return if you wish. I am staying a while." "Madam, you must obey me. I am your husband." "Must I ask my nephew what it is he fears, and why?" "I forbid that." "Then I can only assume it is because you dread what I might learn, like the day you named someone in a king's blue coat a traitor. Yet I ran into John Pearce in that very same coloured coat at the hospital before any other officer in the fleet came ashore. I have to surmise they were one and the same person."
"Wrong,"
Berkeley replied, with a defensiveness that damned him.
"It was a different fellow."
"Was it? I fear you have allowed your hatred of the man to cloud not only your judgment but your self-esteem. And I, as your wife, will obey only a man who shows me the courtesy of being open and honest, which you, sir, plainly are not." Fan waving violently, Emily moved away from her husband, who, looking after her, noticed that nearly every eye in the room was on him. The argument had not gone unnoticed, and it was galling that in the looks he was getting a good proportion had a trace of being thrilled. He strode across to where Elphinstone was supping another cup of punch.
"Sir, I must tell you that I am ready to serve ashore as from this very moment."
The Scotsman looked at him through bleary eyes that denoted his inebriation.
"Have a cup of punch, Berkeley. Carto and Le Poip can wait till morn."
Chapter 10. They might have been termed as useless or dangerous, but there was no mistaking the desire of those 5,000 French sailors to get out of Toulon and back home to their Atlantic ports. They worked with gusto to get out the ship's armament, no easy task, since each cannon had to be hoisted out through its own gun port by a system of ropes, restraints, and pulleys, in a complicity of knots that completely foxed John Pearce. Thankfully, his only task was an occasional one of necessary interpretation, and that was confined to the dozen officers, most of whom seemed a damn sight less Jacobin than he had been led to believe. While the guns were being hauled out, another party was working on the capstan bars, to drag out of the lower reaches of the holds the nets full of round, chain, and case shot, as well as the powder barrels from the gunner's store, with just enough of that commodity left for signalling. Out came muskets, pistols, pikes, and boarding axes, cutlasses and knives, indeed anything that could be used as a weapon, and he knew each man and his dunnage had been searched on coming aboard, so not as much as a knife was going to be allowed. The sail locker was stripped to the bare minimum thought to be required, with only jibs, courses, and topsails left, no topgallants or kites, while every spare bit of timber from planking to spars had been removed, as well as the 100 items of standard stores every vessel carried. Every inch of space would be needed. With each vessel carrying over twice her normal complement, food had to be loaded that would keep them hale for the entire length of the voyage. Beef and pork in barrels, sacks of peas and biscuit, water and wine for a month, which was reckoned at the maximum. Hood had made it plain that no stores could be collected from Gibraltar. This outing was being paid for by the remains of the Bourbon Navy, not the Admiralty, for it was generally held throughout the fleet that his decision to gift the French Navy 4 sound ships would not be welcomed in London. That was trouble enough, without added expense to the Navy Board. Making his way aft when the work was complete, Pearce entered the main cabin, to find it crowded with the possessions of the officers, a knot of the dozen lieutenants working out from copious lists the way they would man their watches. In his hand, Pearce had a copy of the Admiralty signal book, which he passed over to the most senior, a small, stocky fellow who had earlier introduced himself as Gerard Moreau, who would command the lead vessel, Apollon, explaining that when they needed to contact Ferron, this was the book they must use. "But, monsieur," Moreau replied in French with a slightly mystified air, "none of us here speak English." "Then, monsieur, you will have to use that one most." Pearce opened the book at the signal that requested another ship to come alongside, adding, "I doubt you will need much signalling anyway. Our course is to the Straits, and once through to the Bay of Biscay." He also left a list of instructions: lanterns to be rigged and lit every night, fore and aft, no boats to be launched without express permission, the speed of the whole to be dictated by Captain Digby, who, in a lighter and better equipped vessel, should always have the legs of them. They must heave to if they encountered fog, and use the signal guns to mark their position. Moreau had a ready smile and a twinkle in his eyes as he responded,
"I think you mistake our purpose, monsieur. We have no plans to evade you. We merely wish to get home."
"I fear, monsieur, that my seniors have little faith in your intentions." Moreau smiled.
"Perhaps we can convince you over a glass of wine."
Pearce pulled a face. "I am afraid, Lieutenant Moreau, that I, along with all of the men who will escort you, have strict orders not to mix."
"Ah,"
Moreau replied, throwing up his hands in a very Gallic way.
"They fear you will become Jacobins, perhaps?"
"Perhaps," Pearce replied. Yet he smiled to ensure that Moreau knew such a notion was as absurd as the Frenchman supposed. Seeing that his attitude was creating ill feeling, the others in the cabin were frowning seriously, he decided that his superiors could go hang. They saw things in too black and white a fashion, always separating Frenchmen into virulent revolutionaries or the opposite. Pearce knew different. Such Manichaean simplicity did not exist. Every shade of opinion existed. There would be, no doubt, aboard these 4 capital ships, some bloodthirsty radicals, but they would be few and unlikely to be much of an influence. In the main, these were seamen wanting to return home, and that was a sentiment with which he could not disagree.
"1 glass, monsieur, to be amicable."
L'amitié required that to be several glasses, not one, and he got to know the names of the others who would command the vessels. Pascal Garnier was the next senior lieutenant, and he would command Orion. Hector Jacquelin, a less friendly fellow, came next in line, and would take charge of Patriote. The most junior, Forcé, having Entreprenant. The other 8 lieutenants present would be the watch officers on each vessel, and they showed uncommon civility as they sorted out their needs, leaving Pearce thinking that they were employing a good method to achieve their ends. It was, on the whole, Jacquelin accepted, a very sociable atmosphere, one which was not appreciated when he went aboard his own ship to face Henry Digby. "You are supposed to have nothing to do with them, Mr. Pearce, and here you come back on my deck with the odour of their wine on your breath." "I took a glass to be friendly, sir, and I cannot find it in me to condemn them for their aim of getting home." "And what about their politics?" Digby demanded. It was a sad reflection, Pearce thought, as he looked into the irritable face of his superior, that even one as intelligent as he seemed to be could not get hold of the notion that Frenchmen were no different to Britons. They were just as fractious and divided as any other race, and that included his own. Like Scotsmen, to put any 2 of that race into private dispute was to garner 3 opinions. "We are to go alongside one of the storeships," Digby growled. "Lord Hood has sanctioned your notion of us carrying carronades. Oh, and that fellow Lutyens is to join us, since no French surgeon would agree to serve such Jacobins. Once we have those aboard, all we need is a wind." Shenton, at the door of his pantry, could hear the conversation in the main cabin, and though he wanted to intervene, he was powerless to do so. Toby Burns, dining with his aunt, was on the rack, and much as he twisted and turned, he was slowly being roasted. The truth was coming out as she, quietly but persistently, posed question after question, and they had moved on from the retaking of the Lady Harrington to what had happened subsequently. "I was told," the boy said, head lowered, "should a king's ship seek to press Pearce and his companions from the Lady Harrington, provided they did not jeopardize the safety of the ship, I was not to interfere, it being legal for the Navy to do so." "And it was my husband's express order that you should act as you did?" The positive reply was so soft as to be almost inaudible. "Then, though I find it hard to fathom, Toby, I cannot condemn you. It is too much that one as young as you should be given such a terrible amount of responsibility." That got a louder response. "I've felt the responsibility keenly, Aunt Emily," which engendered a sharp rejoinder. "Not keenly enough to decline to be treated as a hero." How distant that seemed to a now crestfallen Toby Burns. If he had ever seriously harboured the thought that he had betrayed John Pearce, it had quickly faded on his arrival back in England. With the war only weeks old, he had found himself fated as a typical chip off the old oak block of Albion. Never mind he was barely breeched, he was a tar to his toes, even at such a tender age capable of the prodigious deeds listed in Ralph Barclay's dispatch, which credited him with the leadership of the whole enterprise in the Trier estuary. In Deal, at the Three Kings Hotel on the beach, every person in the dining-room had stood to applaud as he entered, and the owners would not hear of him paying for his provender. He had suffered an interview with the First Lord of the Admiralty, and going home to Frome he had been hoisted on the shoulders of boys with whom he had done his schooling. Friends, they said they were, even if he could not remember it being so, carried through the streets to cheers, only to come to his own home and find it full of the leading citizens of the town waiting to greet him and shake his hand. And more than that, they demanded he tell his story. He had not wanted to come back to sea, having found his first experience too harrowing for words. The filth of a midshipman's berth, the foul language and downright thievery that was seen as the norm, that and the constant threat, which he never knew to be real or joshing, that he would keep happy the older boys if he cared to join them in some dark place. Nor did being on deck suit him, given he was not a commanding presence. Quite the opposite in his ill-fitting clothes made for someone expected to grow by the foot. He found his newly acquired Uncle Ralph to be a harsh and unpleasant man, the crew people of a type he had only ever hurried past in a street, and his Aunt Emily, who he had looked to for a softer touch, unwilling to cross her husband to ease his predicament. But Toby Burns was a hero. How could he not want to get back to that element which would provide him with more opportunity to garner glory for himself and England? Not even his mother, to whom he was closest, seemed to see the doubt in his eyes when his return to HMS Brilliant was broached, while his father positively glowed, seeming to quite forget that warships got into battles in which people on board were maimed or killed in the most ghastly fashion. He knew just how bad that could be, for the sailors on his uncle's frigate had taken foul delight in telling him so. And then there was that affair for which he was being praised. While he accepted the accolades, Toby Burns knew the truth, knew that he had acted in a cowardly fashion from the moment he was thrown up onto the Breton shore till the act of retaking the merchantman was complete, and he was deeply fearful that, faced with the prospect of death or injury, he would once more behave in a less than impressive fashion. "I did my best to deflect the accolades, Aunt Emily, but I was overwhelmed by enthusiasm." "I bet you were, you little shite," thought Shenton, who knew that it would not be the boy who would suffer for these revelations, but his captain. And he was right. "Toby," said Emily with a serious face, "I shall not mention this again, and I would request that if you are asked to describe the conversation of this dinner yourself, you decline to do so. And I think you should draw a veil also over the exploit for which you are praised." That was a hard request with which to accede. On the voyage out in HMS Victory he had more than once been the guest of the wardroom, and on one occasion had even dined in the company of Lord Hood. In the mid's berth he had been treated with respect, the same on deck, and, free from any duties, being a supernumerary, he had quite enjoyed the experience of being at sea in what was, in truth, a cruise. Even if deep down he knew it to be misplaced, to be treated as a hero was exceedingly pleasant. "It would wound me to have to insist, Toby." "I will do as you say, Aunt Emily." "Thank you. And not a word of this conversation to Captain Barclay." "He'll hear it all right," Shenton said softly to himself. "Every bleatin' word." He then entered the cabin and asked, with a large and insincere smile, "Is you ready for the cheese, Mrs. Barclay?" Emily nodded, then said, "Please ask if a boat can be ready after dinner to take me over to Mr. Lutyens." "Aye, aye, madam." "I will be back in a few weeks at most, Emily," said Lutyens, aware that the news of his departure was not being well received. "Then I will have no one to talk to for that time." "Your husband?" "Is no longer much aboard," Emily said quickly.
He is ashore working on the defences around Fort Mulgrave, and when he returns it is only to snatch a quick meal and sleep."
"If I read your tone aright, you have not repaired the breach that occurred at the Trogoff's ball."
"No," Emily replied, then in a rush added, "Heinrich, can I confide in you?"
"I hope you feel you are safe to do so."
The story came tumbling out, every detail, and as he had done before, he pretended no knowledge of the truth. As Emily talked of her nephew, Lutyens' mind went back to the original observations he had made and noted at the beginning of their voyage. He had watched Burns, as he had everyone else. The boy was plainly not cut out for the life, always with a face either miserable or concerned, with no appearance of knowing what he was to do or an ability to absorb his duties. Quite certainly no capacity for bluff. Hardly surprising, then, he had acted the way he had. There was no condemnation from the surgeon. That was his purpose for being at sea, to find out how men, even boys in the confines of a ship, exposed perhaps to harsh punishment, certainly to rough company, possibly battle and death, would react. He had left a profitable practice and the prospects presented by a well-connected parent for this. And here was Emily Barclay, another object of observation, confiding her deepest worries to him. His hand itched to get it all down on paper, yet he also had to be pragmatic. "I must advise you, Emily, that no man is perfect. Your husband is acting by his own lights in a proper manner, and harsh as it may seem to you," he left the rest hanging in the air. "You must, I think, find a way of healing this spat, for from what I have seen of Captain Barclay, I fear he is not equipped to do so." "I find it hard to forgive him." "No doubt. But forgive him is what you must do, because if you do not, I fear that the rest of your married life will suffer." Emily either did not want to consider such a thing or admit that it had occurred to her already. Instead, she looked at his chests, the one with his clothes, the other with his potions, unctions, and tools of his trade. "I see you are ready to depart." "I have no wish to hurry you, my dear, but I am expected aboard." "Mr. Lutyens, I welcome you and say, without a word of a lie, I am happy to see you once more." "Thank you, Mr. Digby." The surgeon turned to acknowledge John Pearce, and behind him all the brilliants who were aboard. Martin Dent, the cheekiest, made a dumb show of him scribbling. "I believe you have instructions not to fraternize with the Frenchmen you are escorting." "That is so." "It is also impossible, sir. They do not have any medical men of their own, apart from one or two who may have served as mates to a surgeon. So, if anything occurs, and on a voyage like this I suspect it must, I will have to go on board their vessels to treat them. And since I do not speak their language with anything approaching felicity, I fear Mr. Pearce here will need to accompany me." "Let us get to sea, Mr. Lutyens, away from the prying eyes and ears of admirals. When needs must, we will do what is necessary." "Heinrich," said Pearce, "allow me to name to you the master, Mr. Neame. The fellow with the bandage you have already encountered." Lutyens nodded to Harbin, who had his head swathed in white linen. "Mr. Harbin, see Mr. Lutyens to his quarters." "Ahoy, Farron!" The shout had them looking over the side to a boat which contained, apart from its oarsman, one old sailor with a face as lined as leather, and another substantial fellow who went by the name of Blubber. Pearce called over to them to welcome them aboard. "Latimer, Booth, I bid you a hearty welcome. I must say I never thought Taberley or his captain would release you." "He was in a right old passion when he got his order, and no error," said Latimer as his feet touched the deck, this at the same time as his knuckle brushed his forehead. "I o'erheard him say that he would dearly like to horsewhip you, your honour." "Thought he was going to do it to us," added Blubber. "Never seen the like." "Not that you'd have felt it, Blubber," called Michael O'Hagan. "You're too well padded." "Belay that," shouted Pearce. aware that Digby was not pleased with the interjection, which smacked of ill discipline.
"See these men below?"
"Have you taken note of the wind, Captain?" asked Neame, sniffing as though the breeze, which had shifted, had a smell.
"I have, Mr. Neame. I think, gentlemen, we are in all respects ready for sea. Mr. Pearce, please go aboard Apollon once more and speak to... what's the fellow's name again?"
"Lieutenant Moreau, sir."
"I dare say he is in the nature of a commodore now. Anyway, tell Monsieur Moreau to start warping his ships out of the inner roads."
"Aye, aye, sir," Pearce replied, before calling for a boat party. They looked, with their gun ports closed, like the real threatening article as they emerged into the outer roads, a quartet of 74s being towed by their boats, the rowing men straining mightily to haul their bulk. Digby was aboard HMS Victory, receiving last-minute orders from Rear Admiral Hyde Parker.
"Stay inshore of them at all times, where practicable. Their departure cannot be a secret to the Jacobins, Digby, and we must expect General Carteau to be salivating at the prospect of taking them ashore as reinforcements."
"I doubt they will be willing to serve, sir. Lieutenant Pearce assured me they are intent on only one thing, getting home."
"And how, pray, does Lieutenant Pearce know this?"
Parker demanded, his round face suffused with irritation. Digby realized that he had dropped a brick, but he could see no way out of it.
"He was in charge of the vessels when they were stripping out their guns, sir. I believe he felt it necessary to describe to them our signals, and in that process he discerned that they are not looking for any other outcome than a swift journey to their home ports." "You will remind Pearce, as I will remind you, to stay away from these rascals. That goes double for your crew. They carry with them a bacillus of disturbance which could affect the whole fleet."
"Yes, sir." Parker dropped his voice, not wishing to be overheard.
"And if they show the slightest sign of waywardness, sink the sods. To my mind, the best thing that could happen to them."
"You will ignore that, Digby," said Lord Hood from the doorway to his sleeping cabin. "Admiral Parker is merely teasing you. These men are like us sailors. I cannot think of a circumstance in which we would watch fellow seamen drown."
"Sir."
"It does, however, occur to me that you may find it more convenient, certainly to our cause, to let them go ashore in something other than a French naval port."
Digby looked at Hood for a moment in silence, a gaze that was held with a quizzical expression on the old Admiral's face. "Do you wish to give me orders in that regard, my lord?" The slow shake of the head spoke volumes. There would be nothing in writing, indeed no more said, and the only three people who knew what Hood was proposing were in this cabin, one of whom would soon be gone, the other being his right-hand man. He was being told what to do in a fashion that meant it was truly a secret, and in working that out he was also thinking that Lord Hood was a devious old sod.
"I wish you Godspeed, Mr. Digby," Hood finally said. "Proceed to sea at once and await your charges."
HMS Pharaon led the way out into deep water, due south to begin with, to gain both sea room and remove any temptation to pass within even long sight of the positions of the besieging Jacobin forces. Digby was all activity, wishing to show his charges that the ship he commanded was nippy enough in stays to get quickly to any point of danger. The firing of the carronades in practice an added warning that should they transgress, he had the means to chastise them. Pearce was happy too. He might not have got his friends free, but they were with him now, away from the threat of arbitrary punishment. The sun was shining, the sea was smooth, and life was good.
"Mr. Pearce," Digby called, "the signal gun, if you please, and prepare to hoist the orders to alter their heading to due east."
Fairmelow hooked on the flags. Martin Dent and Dysart were there to hoist them. The gunner had loaded his brass signal gun with a blank charge, and as he fired off his puff of white smoke, Digby put down his helm, this as Mr. Neame trimmed the required sails, and HMS Farron came round on her new course in a trice. Flags eventually flew from Apollon, and the other 74s began their turn, more sluggish certainly, but not without grace. Across the intervening waters came the sound of cheering, for in making the change of course, the 5,000 men aboard those ships had no doubt now they were headed for the Straits of Gibraltar and home. High up on Mount Ferron, Ralph Barclay had a telescope to his eye, watching the enemy vessels depart. He kept them in view long after they were out of sight of those at sea level, this being something that, as a naval port, made Toulon so formidable. No fleet could approach without they would be spotted while well offshore. He had concerns, of course, his wife and the need to make peace with her. But overriding all that was the certain knowledge that John Pearce was on that newly captured sloop. And that was good riddance. Chapter 11. "Captain Barclay," said Admiral Sir William Hotham gravely, with only a glance at his secretary to ensure he was noting the words. "It is my sad duty to inform you that I have no choice but to convene a court-martial to study and adjudicate on the events described in the complaint made by Lieutenant John Pearce. Namely, in the month of February this year you did illegally press men not of the sea out of a place from which you were forbidden by statute to do so." "Might I ask when this is to take place, sir?" "I think, Captain Barclay, the sooner the better. It cannot be pleasant to have a cloud of suspicion hanging over you. 5 fellow captains of the requisite seniority have been alerted to attend upon my flag this coming Thursday, and it is to be hoped that the proceedings will take no more than 1 day." "I must then, sir, organize my defence." "I have appointed Lieutenant Piggott to handle that." "An excellent choice, sir, I am sure." Barclay barely knew Piggott except by reputation. He was held to be a choleric fellow who took that trait to extremes in his capacity as Premier of HMS Theseus. He was a man who saw the cat o' nine tails as the best means of maintaining discipline, and Hotham was known to hold him in some regard. He always did with a strict disciplinarian. It was quite possible that Piggott would gain as much from defending Ralph Barclay as his principal would from being so defended. "I will require both you and Lieutenant Piggott to make yourselves available on Wednesday night, when you must reside aboard HMS Britannia in preparation for the court-martial. In this, naturally, you have my permission to sleep out of your ship. The court will be convened at 10 in the morning. Is there anything you wish to put to me?" "No, sir. I am entirely happy with whatever arrangements you propose." "Good. Then please be so good as to return to your duties." If Ralph Barclay's wife seemed less than happy, at least she was talking to him, as he explained why her presence at the court-martial would not be in her best interests. "Surely, husband, you mean in your best interests?" "No, madam, I do not. I have often tried to point out to you that naval service is sometimes, of necessity, harsh. Things may be said that will trouble your conscience, which is in its very nature, given your sex, of a gentle disposition." "If it ever was, Captain Barclay, it is less so now. And might I remind you that my mother made it plain to me that a care for those less fortunate than ourselves was a duty we should never shun. I have, sad to say, held dying babies in my arms, expiring from want of nourishment. I have seen women pass over in the throes of childbirth, men mangled by accidents caused by being driven to unsafe work by uncaring masters, and, as if that were not enough, I have assisted Mr. Lutyens in treating wounded men on 2 very bloody occasions in the cockpit of this very ship." How could he put it? He did not want her there because he wished to allude to the character of John Pearce, to paint him as a rabble-rouser, tainted not only by his parentage, but by his 2 years of contact with the Revolution. In short, to so blacken him that his complaint would be seen in the light of revenge. Emily knew that to be short of the truth, though her husband suspected there was more than a grain of veracity in what was, in any case, his opinion of the fellow.
The nightmare he harboured was of his own wife standing in Hottam's cabin and denouncing such an accusation as false. She had embarrassed him before, and might do so again.
"What would be your reaction, Mrs. Barclay, if I said plainly that I do not want you present?"
He never got a chance to add that she being there would not only distract him, but every member of the court, because Emily cut right across him. "I would say, husband, that at least you are being honest."
"I hope and pray that you think me so always."
She could not reply. To do so would reveal just how much she knew, so it was dissimulation that had her saying, "I think so. By your own lights you see yourself as such."
It was his turn to be sharp. "I cannot imagine by which other light I am supposed to function."
She could not look at him. Emily had given him a chance to plead his career, to say that even if he had been in the wrong by any objective non-service analysis, he had acted as a naval officer should. It might not be clear-cut to a landsman, but it was necessary to a sailor, and essential to a man commanding a ship of war. If that was hard to see as right, it was at least justification.
"I can see by your attitude you leave me no choice,"
Barclay continued, knowing as he spoke that the payment for his words would be a lengthy period of retribution.
"I do not wish you to attend. There, I have said that which I sought to avoid."
"Never fear, husband," Emily replied with biting irony. "I know you have been forced into this by my unbecoming intransigence, that it is all my fault."
"I fear I must request the use of my cabin. I have people I need to interview, and my defending counsel, Lieutenant Piggott, is waiting on deck to aid me. If you wish, I will arrange a boat to take you to the hospital."
"I think you are forgetting, Captain Barclay, that Mr. Lutyens is no longer there. If you provide me with an escort, I will go for a promenade around the town."
"Shenton?"
"Sir," the servant replied, trying to sound as if he was deep in his pantry rather than at the very door of his hutch.
"Fetch Devereux at the double."
"Double?" Shenton said bitterly to himself as he went out on deck. "I ain't doubled this 10 year past, damned cheek." He had not yet told Ralph Barclay of the way Burns had dished him. The time to do that was when there was some advantage to be gained, always a consideration with a master who could be mercurial, all sweetness 1 minute and a damned tyrant the next. If he threatened to check the stock of his wine, for instance, that would be the time. The Premier, Glaister, was on deck, fair-haired, skeleton-faced, to Shenton another sawney jock leeching off English goodwill, to whom he passed on the message. Various shouts brought forth Devereux, the bully and brute who had once been put in his place by Michael O'Hagan. He had soon reasserted his clout once that man had shifted his berth. Most of the crew were afraid of him, first for his fists, and second for his attachment to Ralph Barclay. To Devereux the captain was in the order of a secular saint and could do no wrong. When he appeared to be given his instructions, the man in question wondered if he needed coaching, for he would be a witness for the defence. Then he decided it was unnecessary. Devereux would say what he was told to say. As soon as Emily, parasol in hand, departed, he called in Piggott, a beetle-browed man whose bushy black eyebrows almost touched above his nose. He had a saturnine complexion, made more so by the broken flesh that denoted a heavy drinker, and a rasping voice that terrified the first person Ralph Barclay called into his cabin.
"It matters not, Mr. Burns, that you were not with your uncle on that occasion. It is most pressing that you say you were."
"Mr. Burns," said Ralph Barclay in an unctuous voice. "Or may I call you Toby, since we are related?" "Of course, sir. Honoured, sir." "Let me explain to you what occurred." He looked at Piggott, who nodded to continue. "I openly admit that I went pressing men that night, but, Toby, you will scarcely credit this. I gave the task of finding the right spot to Fairmelow, and though I hate to blacken the boy when he is not here, I fear he got his navigation of the river very wrong." "I dare say that it's easily done, sir," Burns replied, in a gap that left him in no doubt he was supposed to respond.
"The problem is, Burns," said Piggott in his deep, rasping voice, "Fairmeadow ain't here, and it would never do for a post-captain of the standing of your uncle to admit that he entrusted such a thing to a shaver, and did not check the bearings the lad was taking without the perpetrator there to confess it first."
Now you, young Toby, thanks in part to me, but very much because of your own actions, are highly regarded. The smile on Ralph Barclay's face made Toby Burns think of a story his mother used to tell him about wolves devouring little lads who were naughty. And if you was to admit to such an error, then it would be seen in a different light, would it not? There was no need to outline the alternative, that the truth of what happened in the Trier estuary would become common knowledge. In the increasingly warped mind of Toby Burns, he had begun to blame John Pearce for all his troubles. If that sod had not been along, they could have surrendered as soon as they encountered French authority, which is what he had longed to do. No fighting, food and drink provided, certainly uncomfortable, but no more so than service in a damned frigate. "You see, Toby," his Uncle Ralph continued, "Fairmeadow landed me in hot water. I dare say the lad meant no harm, but instead of putting me ashore at Blackfriars by the bridge, he took me into the liberties of the Savoy, which are not more than a few hundred paces apart."
"I can see," rasped Piggott, "that you know nothing of this place."
A shake of the head had him continue.
"It is a refuge for thieves and vagabonds, a home to those running from their obligations, the only hope they have of avoiding Newgate or the Fleet. There is not an honest man within its boundaries, yet no tipstaff can go in there and bring them to book."
"The old Savoy Palace stood there," Ralph Barclay added. "The one-time home to the Duke of Lancaster, who was King Hal's uncle. You know who he is, I'm sure." It was a relief to be able to answer a question without thinking. "Agincourt, sir. Who could not know it?" "Well, within the confines of that old palace is Crown land. A click of Farmer George's fingers could change the status of the place. But our king is not one to pass on a prerogative, however unseemly it is."
"That,"
Piggott insisted, with a look that accused his principal of wandering,
"is where John Pearce and his ilk were skulking. Imagine that a person of that stripe, forced to hide from justice for crimes of which we know not what magnitude, has the effrontery to bring a case against a man of the standing of your uncle."
"Now, if I can establish that I thought we was by Blackfriars, then the case is one of error, not assignment."
"And Pearce, sir?"
"We'll find his case void," growled Piggott. "Not that your uncle is guaranteed to escape censure, mind, but if he is found at fault it will be for his errors and not his actions."
Toby Burns had in his mind's eye then an image of his Aunt Emily, and the plain disapproval she had shown at that confessional dinner. But right in front of him now was the only man who could make his life bearable. His wife plainly would not try. Loyalty was a matter of the best thing for self, and damn John Pearce, to whom he owed nothing. His voice, when he spoke, was tremulous, he knew, but regardless of that, the meaning was clear.
"I can see, sir, that you would be embarrassed by a disclosure such as that which you have outlined, and nothing would distress me more than it should be so. I am sure even the good Lord would say to me, if he could speak directly, to look to where my duty lay."
"Good boy, Toby," said Ralph Barclay, patting him on the shoulder. "And do rest assured that my good officers are, as they have been in the past, entirely at the disposal of your future naval career."
"Will that be all, sir?"
"Aye, lad. Be so good as to send to me Gerson." "Sir," said Midshipman Fairmeadow, "Apollon has hoisted a signal, but I cannot make head nor tail of it." "Then," Pearce replied, "if you cannot, Mr. Fairmeadow, there is little point in referring it to me without you pass me the book." They leafed through the signal book together,
but it made no sense in any language, so Pearce went to Digby and asked permission to close. That given, Neame altered course and sails to take them up hand over fist to the leading French vessel. It was quite telling that with the other 3 vessels in its wake, none had chosen to repeat Moreau's message. Coming up on her decorated stern, Pearce could see the French captain leaning over the taffrail, a speaking trumpet in his hand, and he called out as soon as he thought he could be heard.
"Monsieur, I request that you come aboard and bring the surgeon with you." "You have someone needing medical attention?" "I fear I have someone who is past that, monsieur, but I wish to establish why it is so."
Pearce was aware of Henry Digby standing to his rear, and he turned to translate the request.
"Odd,"
was his captain's response. "If the fellow is dead, bury him."
"It is most important, monsieur," Moreau called out. "I do not assume it to be natural."
Pearce also translated that to a sceptical Digby.
"That means that someone has been done away with, Pearce. If they're going to be killing each other, I don't see how we can intervene."
"I doubt Captain Moreau would ask for assistance if it was not required."
"Are you sure? The fellow might be a hysteric for all you know. Do not tell me you can form a judgment on his character from such a meagre acquaintance as a few shared glasses of wine."
There was a temptation then to tell Henry Digby that he had a very well-developed sense of the worth of people, formed by having met so many in his life and having to make snap judgments of their character. The kind to trust and the kind to avoid were ingrained in John Pearce, who had shared company with both the elevated and the dregs, finding honesty and chicanery were not a matter of a man's earthly worth or his social standing. He had, it was true, only briefly met Gerard Moreau, but he trusted him, and suspected in better circumstances they might well have become firm friends. "Can I say, sir, that I feel we have a duty to support Captain Moreau if he asks us to? I have the impression he would not do so lightly." Digby shook his head slowly, but it was not denial so much as with wonder.
"I cannot put this down in the log, Pearce. Lord Hood would flay me alive for downright disobedience."
"The fact shall certainly never be brought out by me."
"Very well, you may take a boat and Mr. Lutyens and see what our Frenchman wants."
Pearce had a moment of pure regret then. He had never been much good at slippery gangways, and now he was going to face 2, one of which was on a capital ship. As for Lutyens, Pearce could easily imagine that he was an expert by comparison to the surgeon. Good support would be called for. That was when he also considered the notion of danger. He was unlikely to face any of that aboard Moreau's vessel, but he could not be certain.
"Costello, haul in the cutter, if you please, and fetch it alongside."
Looking round, he saw O'Hagan and went forward to address him quietly.
"Michael, arm yourself and come with me."
"We got trouble, John boy?"
"I've got to get off this tub and onto that one over yonder, and that is trouble in itself. But when I go aboard, I would like you at my back."
"Consider it done."
Lutyens had been called and was now on deck in a thick coat with a small leather bag by his feet.
"Martin, Mr. Lutyens' bag, and be so good as to help him into the boat."
Martin Dent was not one to miss such an opportunity.
"Now come along, sir," he said, taking Lutyens' arm as if he was old and infirm,
"and you just lean on me, and we will get you to where you're to go."
"Remind me, Martin Dent," snapped Lutyens, "that the next time I treat you it should be painful."
"Can't get much more so than it is now, your honour," Martin replied, which had everyone in earshot laughing.
"What are you talking about, man?"
"Get on with it, Dent," said Pearce, who half feared that Martin would tell him his ministrations were far from gentle, that the crew would avoid him for anything minor, preferring the pain they had to that they would receive. He was a good surgeon, but he was also a careless one. The sloop was sailing along at the same speed as Apollon, and the green water that lay between them had a disturbed quality that made Pearce queasy. This was going to be no easy passage.
"Mr. Pearce," called Neame, "with the captain's permission, I will head-reach Apollon before we cast you off, which will give you a chance to cross the divide as she comes up on you." "Make it so, Mr. Neame," Digby called,
and the orders were issued to reset some sails and haul on others to get them drawing better, which brought an immediate increase in the ship's speed. Within 10 minutes they were ahead of the 74-gunner, and the crew of oarsmen were in the cutter just waiting for their passengers. Behind him, Pearce could hear Michael uttering a papist prayer.
"Michael, it is only a short excursion. If it is that, John boy, would you be after telling me why your face is as green as that water?"
"It was having you behind me with a cutlass," Pearce joked, as Michael passed him and went through the gangway. Pearce followed Michael, putting his first foot on one of the sopping wet battens that led down to the boat, his hands gripping the man-ropes with as much strength as he could muster. He had had the ignominy of dropping into a bobbing cutter before now, and he did not want a repetition. The cutter was rising and falling several feet, and thankfully he timed his skip perfectly to land where hands could keep him and his dignity upright. Lutyens made the accepted fist of his boarding, but he was eased down by two of the oarsmen climbing up, one hand and one foot on rope and batten, to aid him down.
"Cast off! Haul away, lads!" shouted Costello as the cutter was pushed off from the side of the ship.
The oars bit hard, the men near standing to get purchase on their primary stroke. But they were clear, and cutting an angle that would bring Apollon up on them, with Dysart, boat-hook in hand, taking charge of ensuring the lumbering ship of the line did not run them down. Moreau had obviously surmised, or perhaps he had watched and seen, that Lutyens was no sailor, so he had rigged a chair on a whip from his yards to heave the surgeon on board. Self-respect demanded that Pearce could not take that route, and so he began a long climb that was nothing short of hair-raising as the French ship swung and dipped on the swell. He came to deck level sweating, and stepped through to raise his hat, only realizing as he did so that Moreau had taken down the Bourbon flag with which he had been supplied, and replaced it with a tricolour stretched across the poop rail. The grin was wide, the eyes positively dancing, as the Frenchman said, "You salute the true flag of France, Lieutenant Pearce." "One day, sir, I must tell you why it is a standard for which I have little respect." Michael O'Hagan came through the gangway with a hissed exclamation of, "God bless all here!" They joined Lutyens before being led below to a very crowded and gloomy main deck, the only light and air coming from the open gun ports, with Moreau shouting for space to be cleared, which was obeyed with sullen resentment, leaving Pearce to wonder at the looks they were all getting, the Frenchman included.
"I don't rate our chances much, John boy, if this lot think to take us."
"Then take your cutlass out of your belt, Michael, and let them see the blade."
"Christ in heaven!"
Michael exclaimed, as the crowd parted to reveal a body hanging from a hook, which had at one time been used to house the implements for working the guns. The face was black, the tongue protruding and half bitten through, this while the feet were toe down on the deck above bent knees. Lutyens looked at the cadaver and said, "I do hope that I have not suffered that journey in a boat just to tell you this fellow is dead."
"No, monsieur, we know he is dead. What we wonder is how."
Once translated, Lutyens responded sharply, "Well, is that not obvious? He hanged himself." Moreau looked from Lutyens to Pearce and back again, and the surgeon's words, when related to him, made him terse.
"I would wish you to tell me, monsieur, how the man can hang himself when he is taller than the space between the deck and the beams above. I want you to tell me if this poor fellow has been murdered, and if that is the case, I would be curious to know if you have a view of how that can be done without the knowledge of over 1,400 men in a ship so crowded as this."
Chapter 12.
"I do not have aboard so much as a sword with which to defend myself,"
said Moreau once they were in his cabin, which consisted of what would have been his sleeping quarters and a quarter-gallery privy had Apollon carried its normal complement.
"Your marines searched everything before we were allowed near these ships. All our weapons were confiscated."
"I cannot see, monsieur, what I can do about that."
Lieutenant Pearce, I barely know you, yet I think you understand more about France as it is at the moment than most of your fellow officers.
I have witnessed at first hand, Captain, that your fellow countrymen are no strangers to excess. He held Moreau's gaze then, wondering if he could guess just what he had seen. Mobs from the filthy faubourgs of eastern Paris, spurred on by ranting orators, who had, 1 year past, broken open the jails and massacred the prisoners. Of crowds bearing torches that illuminated the bloody remains of the newly beheaded stuck on pikes as they marched, spitting venom through the streets, promising the same fate to anyone of property. He could tell him of the crowded prisons where people died for want of the basics of life, while those who survived faced a tribunal that had only one verdict, the guillotine. That he did not do so was due to one fact only. He had no notion to mention his own father, and thus recall and need to explain a painful memory.
I have to tell you, monsieur, that every shade of opinion is present aboard this ship, and I am sure it is the same on our consorts. Most of the sailors think nothing of politics, wishing only for their own hearths. But there are die-hard Jacobins stalking these decks, and, worse yet, men who think even such blood-obsessed creatures lacking enough fire in pursuit of revolutionary purity.
"What is going on, Pearce?" demanded Lutyens, whose French was too poor to keep up with such a flow of words.
"Oh, one moment, Mr. Lutyens," Pearce replied, before turning back once more to Moreau. "What is it you want?"
Enough arms to enforce discipline, weapons with which to ensure that anyone advocating any kind of cleansing of those they call traitors can be taken and confined, and if they are guilty of murder, hanged as surely as that man was today.
Pearce broke off to explain to Lutyens, which had the added advantage of allowing him to think. He knew he could not make such a decision himself. It was up to Digby. But was it worth his while to put the case for arming the French against the express orders of Hood?
If you do not provide this, monsieur, there are many who will not see the Straits, never mind Biscay. And I may be one of them.
"Who was the dead man?" asked Lutyens, a question Pearce passed on, thinking it was an inquiry he should have made himself.
He was mate to the sailing master, and he had only one aim, one I fear he made too public, to get back to his home port of Nantes and join with his fellow Vendéans to fight against what he sees as the godless swine in Paris. There are others, of the rank you English term as warrants, who harbour similar views.
Why not kill them all now?
They will wait, but I know not how long. Perhaps it will happen as soon as they sight the approaches to our home ports. Perhaps it will be tomorrow.
What would you require?
Pistols, cutlasses, a stand of muskets, enough to arm a guard I will appoint to ensure discipline.
And you would suggest that Garnier and the other captains are gifted the same?
I would.
How can you know they face the same problems?
Moreau just smiled then, a full grin that spoke volumes, and Pearce surmised that despite strict instructions not to do so, those commanding the 4 French warships had met and colluded, probably by boat and at night. The request he was hearing was from them all, not just Moreau. "I will have to put this to my captain, Mr. Digby. Only he can decide on this."
Might I add, for his consideration, Lieutenant Pearce, that we are yet to pass out of the orbit of Marseille. Should these ships fall into the wrong hands, that may serve for some of the diehards as a port to aim for.
"I hope, Captain Moreau," Pearce snapped, "you have seen we have the means to prevent that."
Moreau's smile was grim now.
4 capital ships, 1 sloop, armed with the means to do what? Hold them on the waterline. And we, with men on board who know only too well how to contain such a thing, with plugs and frapping. I would say that, try as you might, you will not stop all 4 from getting to Marseille.
"There is something you're not telling me, Captain."
"Monsieur, there are things I cannot tell you."
I will put the case to Captain Digby. I can do no more. And I will add, it might aid your request if you were to take down that tricolor from the poop rail and rehoist the Bourbon flag." No! Henry Digby looked really angry that the idea had even been broached, though Pearce had been careful not to say if he was in favour or against. "They must look to persuasion. Gifting them arms is not something that can be done in secret. I can just imagine the Admiralty clerks, or Lord Hood's scribblers, asking me where all our muskets, cutlasses, and pistols had gone." "There is that. I doubt, once given so, we would get them back again." "Precisely. I leave it to you to work out how to tell Captain Moreau." That made Pearce's stomach drop. Both the sea and the wind had got up while he had been aboard Apollon, so the journey back to his own ship had been a wet, and to Pearce's mind, a precarious one. As the cutter rose, fell, and swayed, Lutyens had closed his eyes, and Michael O'Hagan had called for the intercession of every saint in the Catholic canon. Yet he had to admit that the likes of Dysart, Costello, and Martin Dent had shown no fear, which he put down to the natural fatalism of all sailors. What Digby was suggesting was no more than a return journey, for such a message could not be imparted through a speaking trumpet. Just then, after the most peremptory knock, Fairmelot burst in. "Lead French ship is signalling again, sir, and this time it's clear the message is distress." Both Pearce and Digby were on deck in a flash, grabbing telescopes and raking them along the deck of Apollon, not missing the fact that the tricolor was now at the mizzen masthead. Fairmelot produced the signal book and confirmed that his interpretation was correct, just as the signal disappeared, to be replaced by the raising and dipping of another tricolor, only this time it was on the mainmast halyard. This had Pearce thinking about Moreau, and the feeling he had harboured that the Frenchman was holding something back. "Mr. Harbin, aloft with a glass and keep an eye out due north." "Sir, can we ask Mr. Neame where we are in relation to the port of Marseille?" That got him an odd look, but it only lasted a second before Digby nodded, and he showed his appreciation of the point by immediately ordering a change of course from sitting in the wake of the bigger vessels to being inshore of them. "What do you anticipate, Mr. Pearce?" "I think, sir, since our departure from Toulon was so talked about, there must have been some kind of secret communication from within that place with elements of the besieging force. So, knowing that only one destination is possible, namely the Straits, an attempt might be made to take these vessels and the men they contain into Marseille." "If that is the case, they will know both the name and the nature of the escort." "I think it would be wise to assume that, sir." "Mr. Pearce, do you think that Captain Moreau still has control of the Apollon?" "We will only know that, sir, if our chargers change course." "Sir," shouted Fairmelot, "I call your attention to the other 3 vessels." They needed no telescope to observe that now all 4 vessels were raising and dipping tricolors. Whatever had happened on Apollon was being repeated on her 3 consorts. "I think," said Digby in a calm voice, "that we have a serious problem here, Mr. Pearce. Beat to quarters and clear for action. Mr. Neame, we have the wind. Take me in close to Apollon. I want to be across her hawse, to let her know, whoever has taken charge of that vessel, what they face." HMS Pharaon was a hive of activity, as everything not required was shipped to safety. The cutter and the jolly boat were hauled in and loaded with the livestock, chickens, sheep, and the ship's goat. If matters got serious, they must be cut loose to drift. All the paraphernalia of a ship sailing easy had to be cleared from the deck, while below the gunner was handing out flintlocks and his made-up cartridges to the gun captains and powder monkeys. This, while on deck, the restraining tackles on the cannon were cast off, the gun ports opened, the ship showing her teeth as the guns were run out. "Deck there!" shouted Harbin. "Due north! I see boats approaching, sir. Not warships, more like big luggers being worked by sweeps, and I think they've been rigged with cannon in the bows." Digby shouted, but even doing that he sounded calm. "To the number of?" "4, sir, and very low in the water.
which will, I think, be the guns, and perhaps the number of crew they are carrying?"
"A lot of men, Mr. Pearce, and to the number of 4. I would hazard they intend to board their own national vessels."
"Mr. Harbin, I need to know the calibre of those cannon as soon as you have a clear enough sight of them." "Aye, aye, sir."
Coming up hand over fist and passing inshore of each French ship in turn, the silence from them had an eerie quality. Certainly there were men on the quarterdeck conning the ship, but there were none that Pearce could recognise when he went up the shrouds to have a look. It was Latimer, with sharp sight for his age, who drew attention to the flag draped in the quarter-gallery casements of Apollon. Every other eye on all 5 vessels was looking north.
"Wouldn't do, your honour, to make too much of looking at it."
"A fleur-de-lis pennant," Pearce said, as he swung his telescope in an arc that took in the whole French squadron.
"That, sir, has to be Moreau sending us a signal."
"How can you be so certain?" Pearce explained about the trick with the flags as he had gone aboard, which had Digby adding, "If it is a signal, it is, I think, one only we can see." The quarter-galleries were to the side of the main cabin, and wardroom, necessary rooms, and sleeping cabins for the ship's senior officers, captain on the main deck, ranking lieutenants below. What was being waved in the casements of Apollon would not be visible over the stern or from above. "It is a pity they are occupying those, Pearce. I had half a mind to put a ball through those casements to remind them of the cost of rebellion." "If I may point to a dilemma, sir," Digby interrupted him with a bleak smile. "I know, Mr. Pearce, if we fire into any part of these vessels, we may well maim or kill the innocent rather than the guilty." "What do you propose to do, sir?"
"Why, Mr. Pearce, we must engage these vessels coming out from shore. Mr. Neame, set us due north. I want to get within range of those fellows and sink them." "Aye, aye, sir."
On a southeasterly wind, HMS Farron swung onto her new course with ease, yards braced round to take the breeze on a good point of sailing.
12-pounders by the look of the armament, sir,"
shouted Harbin. "That is good. I feared something heavier." "Still formidable weapons," advanced Pearce. "Greater than our own, bar the carronades." "But low in the water, which will reduce their range," Digby said more to himself than to his second-in-command.
"Mr. Pearce, I wish you to take charge of the larboard cannon with Mr. Fairmelow. I shall call Mr. Harbin down to assist me, but I need good eyes at the masthead." "Martin," Pearce shouted, "aloft and relieve Mr. Harbin." "I want to fight them, sir." "Then spit at them from the masthead. Move!"
Martin was running up the shrouds in a flash, and as soon as he relieved Harbin of the telescope, that youngster leapt for a backstay and slid down to the deck, reporting immediately to Digby. "They have closed up, sir, to sweeps near touching, to increase the effect of their cannon."
"Then, Mr. Harbin, I think they have made a mistake."
"How so, sir?"
"Go to your station, Mr. Harbin, and you shall see very shortly."
John Pearce was watching Digby closely, impressed by his calm. He could remember going into action as the last officer standing, and he knew his heart had beat hard enough to nearly burst out of his chest. Yet the man in charge now looked and sounded as though he had not a care in the world, and if he had a plan he had yet to impart it, content as he was to merely observe the approaching enemy, now visible from the deck.
"These luggers seem to be better for fishing than fighting, and I doubt there is a naval officer aboard. If they are from Marseille, the Jacobins will have removed the head of anyone competent when they took back the town. Raise your long guns to maximum elevation and train them as far forward as possible. I wish to show them the limits to which they might approach in safety. With luck they may turn tail."
Digby ignored the audible groan that came from the gun crews. They wanted blood.
"And make sure the bow chasers are manned and loaded. Tell me when you are ready."
Pearce tried to detect some impatience in that remark, but there was none. Digby waited until his gun captains had driven their elevation wedges in as far as they would go, and levered the cannon round so the muzzles were near to touching the gun-port sides, before ordering Neame to bear up, the ship turning on his command.
"One at a time, Mr. Pearce, for the sake of our timbers."
Pearce walked down the line of gun captains, each holding a lanyard which kept them several feet away from the cannon. He tapped each one on the shoulder, and they pulled, immediately leaping back as the gun roared, sending forth a plume of orange flame surrounded by a blast of thick black smoke, and a very visible ball arcing through the air. Each one of the 6 hit the sea well in front of the oncoming gunboats, sending up a plume of white water high into the air. By the time the last cannon was fired, the first was through the process of reloading, and within a minute Neame had them back on a closing course.
"They come on," Digby said, before turning to address the crew. "It seems, lads, we have a scrap on our hands. What say you to that?"
They cheered as hard as their lungs would allow, and when that died away, Digby added,
"You know, if I heard that, I would put up my helm and run for safety."
The blast from the reply reached them before the balls that were fired, and Farron was treated to a show of plumed water herself, but a good cable's length ahead of her bowsprit. Neither elevation or wind favoured the enemy.
"Thank you, my friend," Digby said to himself, "for gifting me your ultimate range." Louder he called, "Mr. Neame, stand by to bring us round again, but this time hard on to the starboard tack. Mr. Pearce, all cannon to remain at maximum elevation, but I want the second broadside to be double-shotted. These fellows need to be surprised."
"Will they not reply in kind, sir?"
"I hope so, Mr. Pearce, for if they do, the recoil will probably sink them."
"Now there," said leathery old Latimer to his best mate, Blubber Booth, "is a Johnny that knows his game."
"Reckon there's any coin in this, lads?"
"Not a bean, Blubber, not a bean."
Overhearing that, Pearce was made acutely aware of the fact that he did not know his game. Faced with the same dilemma as Digby, he would not have been sure what to do, and he only had to look at his senior to feel that he did. Mind, he reassured himself, there was no guarantee that his captain was in the right, but he had the appearance of knowing, and an air of confidence that every man in the crew could observe, so Pearce moved from his position amidships and went to talk to him. Quietly, so that no one else could hear him, he addressed his captain, only to be just as quietly admonished. "You have left your station, Mr. Pearce." "I am curious, sir, as to what you intend."
"Intend? Why, to sink those fellows ahead of us or persuade them to turn tail."
"May I be allowed to inquire how?" Seeing Digby stiffen, he added, "I ask only for the purposes of wishing to learn, sir, and I am not so far from my station that 6 paces will not get me back to it." Considering that took several seconds, but Digby obliged eventually.
"Whoever commands those boats appears to be a fool, Mr. Pearce, or he is no sailor. You will observe he is coming on grouped."
"And that is wrong?"
"Gunboats on sweeps may move as they wish and ignore the wind. Thus they should split up and stand off a square rigger like us, and use their power of manoeuvre to split our defence. Get close, aim guns for the waterline, and try to hole us, then haul off hard to reload. The last thing he should want is to face a row of cannon firing off a steady deck at such a tempting target as 4 grouped boats."
"You've seen this before?"
"Heard about it, for it is a nightmare to ships on blockade. The man in command yonder thinks that his guns close-grouped have more effect, when the opposite is the truth. I think in about a minute we may shock him out of his misplaced complacency, sir."
"If they split up, sir, would you not be obliged to select one to attack?" Digby smiled, but did not look at his subordinate.
"I would."
"And the fate of that boat?"
"Oh, total destruction, very likely, in the process of allowing his consorts to strike."
"So perhaps the man in command knows what to do, but has failed to get one of his subordinates to act as a sacrificial lamb."
"Very possible, Mr. Pearce, which tends to imply he might lead them, but he does not command them, a direct result, I would say, of the revolutionary ideas. Now, please be so good as to go back to your station."
Pearce obliged, and within a minute Digby shouted,
Mr. Neame, stand by to bring us up into the wind. Mr. Pearce, fire as you bear."
"Deck there!" Martin Dent yelled. "French 74s have put up their helms to close with us."
"That I anticipated, lads," Digby called out. "Pay it no heed. Now, Mr. Neame."
The rudder swung hard as the sheets were let fly, and Farron swung round in her own length, with the wind slowing and steadying her. This time it was left to the gun captains, each crouched to peer through their gun ports straight along the length of their piece, calculating the point at which to haul on that lanyard, a few heartbeats before the gun actually sighted on the target. The timbers shook as each gun went off, and though they could not see it, below Lutchen's instruments were flung from his sea chests to the deck by the vibrations. It was obvious that the enemy had just been waiting for the sight of smoke, and all 4 of their cannons spoke simultaneously. But Digby had the better plan. Their balls fell short, close enough to soak the decks, but not enough to do harm. The balls from Farron, firing from that slightly higher elevation, landed right amongst them, smashing 2, one on the bows, another on its starboard timbers. The first to be struck shuddered in the water as if a great hand had stopped its progress. The second fell away as the weight of the shot, and a man steering who lost his grip, took its bow on into a third boat, forcing it to sheer off. Just then the first of the double-shotted balls landed amongst them, bringing on chaos as some of the sweeps disintegrated.
"Mr. Neame,"
Digby commanded in that same calm voice,
"get me back on course to close. Mr. Pearce, the carronade will, I think, shortly come into its own."
The one remaining fighting vessel was not done, and now that the range was closing it sent a ball flying up through the scantlings to the deck of Farron, which caused splinters to fly in a dozen directions, the screams proving that it had been telling. Digby ordered the 2 bow chasers to respond, nodding at the way Neame used the rudder to ensure that each in turn could take good aim. They did not strike wood or flesh, but the amount of sea-water that soaked their enemies must have been off-putting. That was confirmed by a wild shot in response that went through the rigging without doing much more than split a couple of ropes. The range had closed and was now down to musket shot.
"Mr. Pearce, as soon as she bears."
Pearce was behind the carronade himself, lanyard in hand, this being a weapon he had come to respect. The ball, 32 pounds, would wound a capital ship, even a 100-gunner if fired at close enough range. What it would do to a flimsy vessel that was in reality a fishing smack of the Mediterranean kind did not bear thinking about. As it bore just to the right of the target, he pulled. The cannon, on runners instead of rope restraints, shot backwards onto its stops. It did not hit the enemy, not being a weapon for accuracy but effect, yet the amount of water it shifted told that last lugger what it faced, and as soon as the water which had obscured the vessel fell back, they could see the man in command had ordered his helm put down, his sweeps brought in, and his single sail in the act of being raised, leaving his companions either sinking or fighting to stay afloat.
"That, sir," said Digby, "is the first wise thing you've done this day. Mr. Neame, put us about and close with Apollon. It seems we may have to go aboard and rescue this fellow Moreau. Mr. Pearce, make up a boarding party. Muskets to clear away, cutlasses and pistols to follow. We will be going in through the wardroom, and we must risk the innocents. Anyone who seeks to impede you is to be killed on the spot."
"Sir." As HMS Farron came about, Pearce could see the quartet of French 74s spread across the ocean, still coming on, despite the fact that those sent to take them were either foundering or fleeing.
"No mercy, Mr. Pearce. We do not have time for that, for I fear we may have to subdue each vessel in turn if we show any leniency."
"Do we arm them, sir?"
"No need now, Mr. Pearce. The troublemakers have revealed themselves. Once we get aboard and have re-established proper command, we will put them in irons and keep them below."
Digby took charge of the one cannon he was going to use himself, ordering Neame to bring the ship under the stern of Apollon, which they sailed past in utter silence, with not a head peering over the hammock nettings to see what was promised. They had no means to retaliate or to avoid what was coming, as Digby had Farron steered until she lay under Apollone's rudder. As soon as Neame backed the sails, he pulled the lanyard and sent a single cannonball smashing up through the flimsy casement windows and on to blast what wardroom bulkheads had been rigged. The sound of smashing glass and shredded timber had hardly faded when Digby said, in the same voice, devoid of emotion, which he had used throughout, "At your own convenience, Mr. Pearce." The man he addressed did not feel calm. His heart was pounding, and he did not know if it was from excitement or trepidation. "Come on, lads!" Pearce shouted, his sword waving in his hand as he jumped up onto the bulwarks of his own ship, which brought him level with the destroyed wardroom casements. That sword had to be used like a cleaver to get the splintered wood and glass apart enough for him to clamber through. Expecting a fight, he was surprised to see no one on the other side, and so he fetched aboard his muskets. They debouched onto the crowded main deck through shattered bulkheads, more crowded now than before by the way the crew was pressed back in fear. "Take aim," Pearce said, himself raising his pistol, feeling sorry for those to the front of the crowd trying to shrink their bodies from what was obviously coming. Then he said in French, "If someone does not fetch me Captain Moreau this instant, I will open fire." As a group of messengers rushed off, he shouted, "And bring to me that damned tricolor from the mizzen." Chapter 13. With order restored and the most radical of the Toulon sailors confined in their respective cable tiers, the rest of the voyage was set to be peaceful. Entreprenant, Patriot, and Orion had all surrendered without the need to board, and the flags at the masthead were once more flower-patterned ensigns. They spoke with a couple of frigates heading to join the fleet, but it was an exchange through a speaking trumpet only. They were eager to get to the seat of action, and Digby feared to lose touch with his charges. He dreaded the notion of being out of sight if they came across a Spanish warship. The Dons knew the lines of every vessel in the French fleet, and they might see those Bourbon ensigns as a bluff and begin firing without establishing that the ships of their enemy had passports issued by Lord Hood. Such easy sailing left ample time for Digby and John Pearce to get to know one another, and mutual respect, already established, quickly deepened, though that could not be said about their politics or their religion. Digby loved his king and his Anglican God. Pearce had an abhorrence of monarchy and, like his father, saw religion as a conspiracy to cheat the gullible, which meant that it was most often a subject avoided. Their first bout over one dinner on that had been quite enough. "Have you heard of Leibnitz, sir?" asked Pearce. "Who?" He liked Digby, but he could see that he was a typical parochial Englishman. For him any kind of sense ceased at Dover. It was not malice that had him discount influence from abroad, just an upbringing which had been confined first to a mile or two from his home, a Dorset tenanted farm, followed by poor schooling, a midshipman's berth, and a naval wardroom. His views were formed by the invisible walls of the world into which he had been born and inhabited. "Leibnitz is a philosopher." "Not a breed, Pearce, for whom I have much time. They seem to exist to disturb men's minds." "I think this fellow you would like. He maintained that everything that happened was the work of God." "In which he was entirely correct." "Even wars, famine, catastrophe?" "I know what you are about, Pearce, but you will not undermine my faith with such mutterings." "Nor those of Leibnitz. He insisted that such things were all part of God's great plan for the world, a notion that Voltaire quite exploded." "That rascal!" Digby snapped. "There is a man who should have had a mouth restraint fitted at birth." "You have read him?" "Certainly not. I have no notion to make diseased my mind." "Then does the name Hume mean anything?" "Another philosopher, I gather. At least he was an Englishman." "He was actually a Scot. My father studied with him." "I suppose you will use him to sustain your nonsensical opinions?" "I shall put it to you and see
in only one of his propositions, the notion that if there was a supreme being for people to believe in, there was no need to extend to that entity the gift of supreme competence. It might be that such a God created the world in the aforesaid 6 days, in itself a remarkable feat, but surely to populate it with a contentious crew like the human race was not a clever idea. God does not need to be clever. Would that be because he has us to be so on his behalf? Digby reared up at that, seeing quite clearly that Pearce was baiting him. To the senior, such a debate was unheard of. He could not know how often Pearce had engaged with others to raise the question of an all-seeing deity, which was only 1/10 of the times he had heard his father engage in the same debate. The only thing that can be said for religion, sir, is that it makes some men charitable, yet it has served as a refuge for a whole raft of scoundrels. We're approaching Spanish territory, are we not? Home to the Inquisition, where a lack of belief, even a question of doctrine, will result in a horrible death. Papists, Pearce, who are backward in their thinking. And the Mussulmen to the south of us, who have the Prophet? Misguided, but at least we share a God. Travellers from the east talk of other religions. Can they all be right? That was when Digby killed off the discussion. I know I am right, Pearce, and I do not appreciate your attempts to get me to think otherwise. And I must tell you, for you obviously do not know, it is a tradition in the service to leave ashore notions of religion and politics. Nothing is so likely to split a wardroom as those two subjects. The effect of disagreement is pernicious, and although we are but 2 commissioned officers of this ship, I would see the same rule apply. Also, I would point out, sir, that the very ships we are tasked to escort have been brought to their sorry pass by the very kind of questions you pose. Pearce was tempted then to recount some of his experiences, of people learned, rich, and sometimes both, who paid lip service only to their religion so as to keep in place those over whom they held power. He had seen it in the great houses of his own nation, but more so in the salons of Paris, where the men who had brought about the end of absolute monarchy had also brought to book the excesses of the Church. Yet no Englishman, who would condemn an Archbishop of France for his venery and his open flaunting of his mistresses, would even begin to think it odd that the incumbent of the See of Canterbury needed an income of £25,000 to carry out an office that, if the words of Jesus Christ were to be taken literally, should be based on humility and personal sacrifice. "Another glass of wine, sir," Pearce said, knowing that such a thing was best left unsaid.
"Another glass of wine, Captain Barclay,"
said Lieutenant Piggott, filling his own cup as he did so. All around them HMS Britannia was creaking and groaning, the timbers working and occasionally issuing a crack as it rode the swell. Ralph Barclay was wondering, given Piggott's consumption, if he would have a clear enough head for what was coming in the morning, but felt it would be unwise to say anything. It was galling to be in need of such a fellow, and he could not but wonder why Hotham held him in such esteem, if you took out of the equation his inclination to flog. "I think I had best keep a clear head for the morrow, Mr. Piggott."
"I generally has a bit of a fuzz most mornings, sir, but I find it soon goes once I've all seen the cleaning of the decks. Nothing like the wielding of a starter on a bare back to get the head clear."
"You do not leave such tasks to your junior lieutenants."
"Never, sir. As Premier I bear responsibility, and if I am going to face the wrath of my captain for a poorly swabbed deck, then I am going to make sure he who troubles my life does more and trouble his own."
Thank God I only have one night with this fellow, Ralph Barclay thought. Piggott was a difficult man with whom to make conversation, he having so few topics that interested him, and he did not seem to appreciate, as would every naval officer Ralph Barclay had ever encountered, being told of the actions of others. Any attempt to recount his encounters with enemy vessels met with a frown. "You know, Mr. Piggott, I think I may retire." Piggott picked up the bottle.
"Why, this, sir, is as yet half full."
"I am sure you can see to that, Mr. Piggott.
but I lack your constitution in the article of drink."
For the first time Ralph Barclay sensed this choleric-looking fellow was pleased. The man actually thought he had been in receipt of praise. The premier of the flagship had given up his own sleeping quarters to the accused, letting it be known that he entirely approved of the actions of the captain of HMS Brilliant, the general heir in the entire wardroom, and Ralph Barclay appreciated such support from men who understood the problems attendant on manning a ship of war. They were not milksops like Pearce, but proper seamen who knew their trade. Having disrobed, washed, and said his prayers, he slipped into the swinging cot that would be his bed. But sleep would not come, even with the ship rocking and snubbing her anchors. As in all such situations, his mind flitted from memory to idea and back again, all the way to his life as a midshipman, which had been damned unpleasant, though not much worse than that which preceded it. A trader father who drank like Piggott, and was free with his belt, a mother too much in terror of her husband to intervene, indeed a woman who many a morning bore the marks of a previous night's beating. Servants of no refinement whatever, who spied on everything and gossiped so the whole town knew if the Barclays were in hock to their fellow tradesmen, or flush when some local aristocrat finally paid a bill. What was he going to do with that Burns boy? The lad was as near to useless as it was possible to be, yet he was a relative by marriage, and that meant an obligation. Naturally, that led on to thoughts of his wife, of their wedding, with he being able to recall with clarity the cold but clear day, the cheerful friends, added to the wonder he felt that such a beautiful creature had agreed to marry him. He managed to blot from these recollections the fact that Emily's family occupied a house that was entailed to him, that he could have, on his father's demise, slung them out. No, she had come to him not just because of a sense of duty, but because she admired him. But that admiration had been dented. It was galling that she refused to understand, annoying that she applied the mores of her sheltered upbringing to a service that was nothing like family life in rural Somerset. Sailors were not bucolic farmhands or local labourers. Some were rascals of the worst kind, others men who, not in the least refined, when conflict looked imminent and the fleet expanded, left the merchant service for the better conditions on a ship of war. Not pay, but regular food, 14 inches of sleeping space and a berth full of mates all eager to talk of prize-taking. But there were never enough of them, so pressed men were necessary to man the fleet. The nation was at war, and they must be willing to face death so that their country could triumph. There was a brief reverie of Ralph Barclay chastising his wife as his father had done with his mother. A good seeing to with a birch would bring her to heel, bring her back to the proper degree of respect due to her marital master. But it did not last. He knew he would struggle to administer such a punishment, and on reflection he guessed it would have, on Emily, the reverse effect of that imagined. Yet brought to heel she must be, and when he did finally fall into a deep slumber, that was the last thought he had. "Mr. Glaister, I see that certain members of the crew are being shipped into a boat."
"Good morning, Mrs. Barclay,"
the first lieutenant said, raising his hat with his one good hand, the other being still in a sling from a wound taken when the ship was captured. Polite as that was, it did not answer her inquiry, which forced her to repeat it. "They are to attend on Captain Barclay's court-martial, ma'am." Looking into the boat, she could see Coyle, the master-at-arms, a boatswain's mate called Kemp, whom she found unpleasant, Devereux, her husband's new clerk Gerson, and her nephew. "I am at a loss, Mr. Glaister, to think what Mr. Burns can bring to proceedings. From what I gather, he was not present on the night in question." "Captain's order, Mrs. Barclay. Not for me to query." The way the blue-eyed Highlander was looking at her, his sharp-boned face disapproving, it was as if he was telling her that she should think likewise, which was not an attitude that she was prepared to accept.
Fortunately, I have only the bonds of marriage to constrain me, Mr. Glaister, not those of the service. With your permission, I will join them.
Glaister stiffened.
I have orders, Mrs. Barclay, that you are not to leave the ship.
You do not have, sir, the authority to confine me.
Madam,
Glaister replied unhappily,
I have the authority to deny you that boat.
She was tempted to snap at him, but that would be futile. The man was only doing what he had been told. The seat of this problem lay with her husband, not Glaister.
When you say not leave the ship, am I to take it that includes a stroll of some kind? No, but the man Captain Barclay would allot the duty of escorting you is not going to be available. As you will see, Devereux is in the boat.
The jolly boat was pulling away, and looking over the side into the refuse-filled water of the inner harbour, Emily was struck by the fact that Toby Burns kept his face turned away from her, which, given he normally looked at her with sheep-like devotion, or deep worry for some imagined transgression, was disquieting.
I shall take a walk, Lieutenant Glaister, and I shall do so unescorted. I have found that Toulon is quite safe now that all those radical sailors have departed.
The two sets of eyes locked, those of the Premier troubled, hers like flints. She knew she had placed him in a difficult, indeed impossible position. As a gentleman, he could not bar her from what she intended, but it was clear he should. Ralph Barclay had been quite specific, telling Glaister that should she demand, she must be denied a boat. He had said nothing about terra firma. In truth, he should have offered her another escort, but that, in his captain's eyes, might smack of collusion. Upsetting his commanding officer was not a good idea if he wished for advancement.
Very well, Mrs. Barclay, but I abjure you to keep a weather eye open. Toulon may appear safe with a hulk like Devereux a few paces to your rear. It might not be quite so secure for a lady on her own. Nonsense. I shall fetch my parasol.
Emily went below and did just that, but she also dug out her pin-money purse, not containing a great deal of coin, but surely enough for what was needed, a one-way trip in a wherry to HMS Britannia.
The accused and Piggott entered the great cabin just after those officers who were interested had taken what seats were available for an audience. Ralph Barclay was encouraged by the smiles and nods of support he received. He was at least among his peers. Hotham secretary, acting as recorder, called, "All rise," an instruction which everyone present obeyed. A file of 5 post-captains, all with twin epaulettes, entered and stood behind the long table ranged before the footlockers that ran under the casements. The president of the court took out his sword and laid it on the green baize cloth, then sat down, followed by his fellow judges and the rest of the people in the room. Ralph Barclay had no sooner made his seat than the mention of his name had him and Piggott up again. "Allow me to introduce the officers who will hear this case. On my left, Captain Luckner and Captain Breen. On my right, Captain Fellows and Captain Laidlaw. I am Captain Forgem, and I act as president. I must ask you, Captain Barclay, to confirm your name and rank, and name to the court your trusted friend." Barclay obliged, and that was followed by a reading of the charges, which were in all respects a repetition of what Hotham had said to him when he announced this court. "I now introduce to you and the court Lieutenant Elijah Burdett, who will put the case for the prosecution." Good, thought Barclay. He knew the man, and he was well known for his blustering stupidity. Burdett stood, his bright red face and untidy grey hair evidence of the time he had spent in his rank. He had to be one of the oldest lieutenants in the King's Navy, which was a direct result of his inability to both execute his duties and impress those in command. He had been denied promotion for the very good reason that he was unworthy of elevation, only a degree of influence keeping him in employment.
May it please the court, I have nothing but the charges to levy against the accused, those claiming testimony regarding the case having been taken away from Toulon by their duties. Those are, asked the President, Lieutenants Digby and Pearce, Midshipman Femelot, Boatswain Robert Sykes, and the seamen Dent, Dommett, O'Hagan, and Taverner. Do we have any depositions from those missing? Unfortunately not, sir. It seems there was no time to take such a thing prior to their hurried departure. Ralph Barclay was looking at Hotham's secretary, writing in an elegant hand words he knew to be total lies. The man's sang-froid was admirable. There is, however, the verbal testimony made both to Admiral Lord Hood, his captain of the fleet, Rear Admiral Hyde Parker, and to Admiral Hotham on a separate occasion. I asked those officers to provide written statements of what transpired, and with the court's permission, I would like to read them out. It would be best to hear their remarks from their own lips, while also allowing Lieutenant Piggott an opportunity to question them for the sake of clarity.
May it please the court,
Piggott said, looking at his client and sending blasts of stale wine breath into his face as he spoke.
We are talking of officers engaged in the most onerous of tasks, men with great responsibilities. I can speak for Captain Barclay when I say he would not wish them taken away from their duties merely to confirm their written word.
Very well. Mr. Burdett, you may read each one in turn before passing it to the court. The accusations stem from one source only, sir, and that is Lieutenant John Pearce.
None of the others mentioned in the witness list have made complaint?
If they have, sir, it is not recorded.
Carry on.
Burdett read in a sonorous voice, as if it was he who was the Admiral and not the man making the complaint. Some of Pearce's venom was obvious in each one. Indeed, Ralph Barclay could practically hear the sod's voice in Lord Hood's testimony. Parker was more circumspect, relating only the facts, while Hothams told the court that he had needed, on more than one occasion, to remind Lieutenant Pearce of both his inferior rank, the virtues of the man he was traducing, and the fact that duelling between officers of His Majesty's Navy, rank being immaterial, was forbidden. Once Burdett was finished, the President cleared the court so they could read these documents in peace. Piggott was asked to remain for the same reason, but sent out when the 5 captains fell to discussing the contents.
It's a damn shame about not duelling, sir.
Ralph Barclay turned to face Tabley, who was smiling at him.
Nothing would give me greater pleasure than to call out Pearce.
You are not alone, Mr. Tabley.
Can I say, sir, that you have the support of every right-thinking officer in the fleet?
Thank you, Mr. Tabley. Allow me to name to you Lieutenant Piggott. As if to underline his name, Piggott burped as he shook Tabley's hand, and he turned away from the fetid smell as a voice called, "Gentlemen, the court will reconvene."
Mr. Piggott, do you have any remarks to make regarding what you have read?
No, sir.
Mr. Burdett, do you have any more evidence to introduce?
No, sir.
Then, Mr. Piggott, you may proceed to your defence.
Thank you, sir. I call Midshipman Burns.
Toby Burns was terrified long before he came through the door, and the sight of a row of blue-coated captains and that sword on the table nearly had his knees giving way. He was directed to stand centre room, and Piggott immediately asked him his name, rank, and ship.
Now, Mr. Burns, please recount to the court the events, as you recall them, that took place in late February of this year.
Toby Burns opened his mouth, but nothing came out, which had the President say,
"Take your time, lad. All we are after is the truth, and I would remind you that you are not here on trial."
The truth was all the boy was thinking of. If I tell them the truth, I'm dished. Slowly he spoke, hesitant and rasping from a very dry throat, and all the while the recorder's quill scratched across the page, seeming to him louder than his own voice. "The need for hands. The boat upriver. His task to land them west of Blackfriars. Any mistake was his uncle being too indulgent in taking the blame on himself."
"You steered the boat to shore?" asked Piggott.
"I did." The slight commotion made him look round, really no more than people shifting in their seats, one standing to let Emily Barclay sit down. The sight sent Toby Burns' stomach heading down to the floor. Chapter 14. Ralph Barclay had turned at the same small commotion, but his reaction was one of very obvious fury. Yet he could do or say nothing, and he fought to compose his features. Who knows? People might assume she was here to support his case. Her defiance was known only to him.
"Mr. Burns, please tell the court what happened when you landed."
He had to go on. There was no choice. If he blurted out now that his previous evidence was a lie, he would be in the dock as much as his uncle. It was a good thing he had been so thoroughly rehearsed, for that took over, and it was in something of a daze that he answered, "It was pitch black, sir, which gave us no clue as to our true location, and the tavern into which Captain Barclay sent his scouting party would not have known they were in the wrong place entirely, no more than we outside did as we secured the exits."
"There was violence, was there not?" one of the other captains inquired. "The men taken did not surrender without offering resistance?"
"One or two, sir, but not all. I would say that a goodly number of the men recruited took it to be their fate. How could they not, living in such squalor?" All 5 adjudicating captains, Lieutenant Burdett, Piggott, and Ralph Barclay, adopted stony expressions at that statement, lest such a blatant piece of nonsense elicit the reaction it deserved, profound disbelief. Every one of those captains had pressed men in their time, and though they had also recruited volunteers, with bands, posters, bribes, and downright falsehoods about untold wealth, they knew that it was not done in the hours of darkness, and in a place where men were taking their ease.
"I take it," asked Piggott, "since he has been so vehement in his denunciation, that Lieutenant Pearce was not of that number."
"I could not say, sir. He was not at that time Lieutenant Pearce. He was just another volunteer, one face amongst many." As Piggott gave the judges a meaningful look, the sound of a slight cough from behind, which he guessed to be his Aunt Emily, made Toby Burns' skin crawl. He was also aware that he was sweating, conscious that a cabin too full of bodies was turning stuffy, and licking his upper lip, he tasted salt.
"The men were taken into your boats," Piggott continued, "shipped down to Sheerness, where they were given the chance to volunteer for service to the Crown."
"Yes, sir."
"And did you see any evidence of dissension?"
He had seen them coming aboard that grey morning, some bearing cuts, others scars and bruises, rubbing wrists that had chafed at their restraints, 1 or 2 weeping, many confused, others emitting looks of sheer defiance. He had not known it was Pearce when Ralph Barclay cuffed him hard round the ear. That he found out later. "Sir, I can recall, just before I went to my berth, that there was a great deal of jollity."
"Jollity?"
"Laughing, an exchange of teasing."
"Thank you, Mr. Burns. I am finished with this witness, sir."
"Mr. Burdup?" No questions, sir."
"Mr. Burns," said Piggott, "you may step down."
As Toby Burns went to sit to one side, Hotham's junior clerk was dispatched to fetch the master-at-arms. Coyle, still suffering from a leg broken in a storm, came limping in using sticks, then, with some difficulty, knuckled his forehead and removed his cap. The ritual of identity and the Bible completed, he was asked very much the same sort of questions as Toby Burns. For Coyle it was simple. If the captain was to be had up over pressing in the liberties, then that could apply to all who were with him on the night, and he was not ever going to lay himself open to such a charge. Coyle had been a soldier before becoming a master-at-arms, and every brush with authority all his life had led him to treat it with mistrust. He was honest enough to admit he could not recall who was steering the boat, and he quite cleverly managed to avoid saying that Burns was not there. As to location, he had no idea. Such things were left to those qualified to decide, and he obeyed what orders he was given once on dry land. Violence? Some, not much. Despair? There were a few that took that line, but they soon came round and were ready for the king's shilling once it had been explained to them the joys of shipboard life and the prospect of prize money.
"I would say, sir,"
Coyle intoned in response to Pickett's final inquiry,
"by the time they made the deck they were as content a bunch of prospective hands as it has ever been my good fortune to help recruit."
Burdett was again invited to cross-examine, but replied that he could see no purpose in it, as Lieutenant Piggott had been so good as to pose any questions he himself might have thought of. Ralph Barclay heard an approving murmur go round the great cabin, with much nodding of heads, causing the President to rap his knuckles on the green baize to command silence and attention. Kemp came next, and such was his rat-like, snivelling appearance, Piggott got through his evidence quickly, really a repetition of Coyle's, for he created an impression that every word he uttered was a falsehood. But he had one valuable addition to the tale. At the time he had been a boatswain's mate, and had had charge of John Pearce once he had been entered.
"He changed his tune when work was called for, your honour. A shirker he was, always hanging back from what was needed to be done, unlike the rest who was willing. I had to encourage him more than once."
"Changed his tune?" asked Burdett when Piggott handed him over.
"Aye, your honour. He was happy enough to take the king's shilling, but not happy to meet his end of the bargain. And I heard him trying like Billy-O to get others to rise up and rebel."
"In the depositions this court has already studied from our senior officers, it seems that Mr. Pearce was insisting on freedom for others. This he would hardly do without their connivance."
"I won't say they didn't waver, sir. I don't say that at all, for Pearce had a silver tongue, and I dare say for a time one or two fell into his way of seeing things. But hot and cold they would be, with Pearce when he was in their ears, happier with their lot when they was left alone to think it out."
So would you say, Kemp, that Pearce, as a newly recruited volunteer, turned into a troublemaker?" There was almost gratitude from Kemp for having the matter being put to him so succinctly, and he oozed insincerity in his positive response. Devereux said much the same as Kemp, though in an inarticulate mumble that made his evidence hard to understand, so he was quickly got rid of.
"Call Cornelius Gerson."
He had dressed for the occasion. In his new role as Ralph Barclay's clerk, he was free to come and go from the ship as he pleased once his duties were complete. Gone was the checked shirt and rolled-up ducks which he had worn aboard HMS Leander. He had money to spend from his gambling profits, as well as his letter-writing for the illiterate, and he was in a port where folk of quality who had come to Toulon as refugees were having to dispose of their goods and chattels at any price offered to survive. He now wore fine linen underneath a well-made coat, stout breeches, white silk stockings, and shoes with real silver buckles. His hat already off as he entered the cabin, he executed a proper bow to the judges, sweeping that shiny tricorn across his chest and showing an excellent head of near white blonde hair that had been expertly barbered. He looked so much the gentleman that Ralph Barclay resolved to examine his accounts as soon as he returned to his ship.
"Mr. Gerson, you were recruited on the same night as the men named in Lieutenant Pearce's complaint."
"I was, sir."
"A volunteer?"
asked Piggott.
No, sir, I came to the service through an accident.
Explain to the court, please, what you mean by that.
The smile was engaging and designed to be. The slight brush of the hand over his attractive features used to denote both reluctance and modesty.
I was engaged in a prank, sir, he replied, addressing the President directly, showing off to a lady on London Bridge, balancing on the parapet, when I lost my footing.
Emily recalled him that day at Sheerness because he had on nothing but a shirt to cover his nakedness. She had never thought on it before, but seeing he had been engaged in his new task and would be in regular contact with her husband, it suddenly became a matter of interest to her to know the true circumstances of his arrival. She had no doubt he was lying, and no doubt either that of all those who had gone before him, he was likely to be the most accomplished. She could imagine many a woman finding him handsome, for if he had fine features, somehow there was an air of corruption about them, as if he was in fact too gilded a youth, Paris instead of Hector.
It could be said to be ill fortune, yet I landed right by one of Captain Barclay's boats, and stout hands grasped me and hauled me in, saving my life, for I would have drowned for certain in such a strong current as that which races through the arches of London's bridges.
Quite,
Piggott said impatiently, his face conveying the fact that he thought Gerson to be over-embellishing.
As I say,
Gerson continued, not the least bit put off by Piggott's attitude,
I would not be here now, so I was taken aboard with the others, fed and clothed, and asked if I would like to volunteer.
Which you did.
Not immediately, for I had a lot to leave behind. A lady for whom I harboured some affection, a position of some trust to an elderly but kind gentleman. In short, prospects.
Piggott seemed to cut across him again. He knew, if no one else present did, that Gerson was indeed gilding it.
What changed your mind?
Why, John Pearce.
Piggott exhaled a great quantity of air as he barked,
Pearce?
He then turned to the judges and gave them that same meaningful look he had been practising for days.
Why, yes, John Pearce had volunteered, and he said it would be a fine thing if I did so too. He was full of talk of adventure, of exotic climes, perhaps the South Seas, and the money to be made from taking enemy ships. He invited me to join his mess, and showed me much warmth.
One or two heads moved at that statement. With a handsome youth like this fellow, warmth could only mean one thing.
So I found myself persuaded, and went with Pearce to the then First Lieutenant, and signed my name.
You were not coerced.
The handsome face clouded over, and his easy manner was replaced by an unpleasant pout.
I have to tell you, sir, that the notion is alien to me. Coercion would only make me stubborn. I am biddable, but not one to be bullied into anything.
The court, Piggott said gravely, may find it hard to accept that a man who has since made such a fuss was the instrument of your joining the service.
Which makes doubly galling what happened next.
Piggott did not like to see Gerson pout with displeasure. It made him look weak, yet there was no way to stop the fellow.
And that was?
A complete volte-face.
Gerson paused so that those present could admire that touch of French, an indication that he was as educated as he now looked.
Within hours he was at me again to say that I had been forced to serve, that I had been taken from some riverside tavern by violence. Naturally, I refused to be so duplicitous, and we became, I have to tell you, mortal enemies from that moment on.
Did you observe Pearce seeking to persuade others to the course he had proposed to you?
I did, and it gives me no pleasure to say that he had the ear of several, turning them from happy tars into malcontents.
No further questions, sir,
Piggott said with a very satisfied air. Burdett stood up, which surprised and displeased his opposite number. Piggott was sure he had got everything to be had out of Gerson.
Mr. Gerson, you are now, I believe, no longer a common seaman.
Damn the man, thought Ralph Barclay. What is he at? He looked to Piggott, whose face was clouded with fury.
No, sir. Captain Barclay, once he found I was serving on HMS Leander, took it upon himself, knowing my skills, to appoint me as his clerk. Can I ask you, Mr. Gerson, how you came to be on Leander?
Oh, an unforeseeable set of circumstances. I was part of the prize crew that took a merchant vessel called the Lady Harrington back to England. We were come upon in soundings by another naval vessel, HMS Griffin, and since a goodly number of the original crew were still aboard, the captain of that vessel took the men from Captain Barclay's ship into his own, he being short-handed.
You were, in effect, pressed.
Pearce saw it as so. I did not.
Mr. Gerson, I put it to you that you have not been entirely honest with the court.
The babble that created had the President shouting,
"Order!"
Gerson looked confused. Indeed, there was a hint of fear in his countenance. Ralph Barclay sat stony-faced, while Piggott was looking at Burdett as though he would like to kill him.
I put it to you that, in fact, you succumbed to John Pearce's blandishments, that you became, like him, a malcontent, and that Captain Barclay dispatched you back to England to get rid of you.
Sir,
The truth, Mr. Gerson, insisted Burdett.
The restoration of his composure was quick, for Gerson had a brain quite capable of spinning out the consequences of his own words. Suddenly he looked crestfallen, and then he replied in a voice that was nothing like that which he had employed before, being soft and embarrassed.
I am forced to admit, sir, that I fell for Pearce's line, that I forgot my duty to my king and my own signature. Captain Barclay, as you say, took a chance to get out of his ship everyone who had fallen for the notions that Pearce had planted in their minds. Though it was never stated, I think he did not want aboard any man who was not willing to serve. Can I ask you, now you have admitted to your error, what was Pearce's motive?
I doubt he had one, sir, other than to cause trouble. He seemed to relish that above all other things. When we were pressed into the Griffin, I was still under his spell, but his influence waned, and I came to my senses. He is a weather-vane, sir. I was one for a while, but I am no longer such now.
Yet you will have heard he was elevated to his present rank by the express orders of King George. You were present at the engagement which so impressed His Majesty, were you not?
Gerson nodded, head down. This was not going where he wanted.
Did he deserve such an unusual amount of distinction?
Gerson suddenly looked up, his eyes bright.
I think he has taken much credit due to others, sir. I was not alone in advising him of the course of action he subsequently employed. The captain of HMS Griffin was hors de combat. Collective decisions were taken for which Pearce subsequently took all the acclaim, took what was a joint action, and made it his alone. So, sir, the answer is no. I do not believe he merits his elevation. The king, may God bless and preserve him, was duped. No further questions, sir?
Piggott called his final witness, the accused. Ralph Barclay had prepared a long and, he thought, convincing account of his actions, a testimony that would incline the court in his favour, but was aware that Emily was behind him, knew that she would hear every word. He could not tell his version of events with her eyes boring into his shoulder-blades.
So he squared those shoulders and said, "Sir, I am the captain of HMS Brilliant. I personally commanded the party that night we were out seeking volunteers. If some violence was used, I was not aware of it, but such ignorance does not excuse me. My commission gives me many things, but it also gives me responsibility. You have heard from others their version of events, and I feel I can add little but this, that whatever the court decides, It is on my shoulders the verdict should fall. With command goes the responsibility of a ship's captain, and I will not shrink from that."
Piggott, who had a whole sheaf of questions to ask, looked dumbfounded. He barked his next words.
"Mr. Burdett!"
The old buffoon looked at Ralph Barclay with his wet eyes and said, "I see no further point in question, sir. I feel the case has been fully examined, and to interrogate Captain Barclay would only make more uncomfortable to him what must be an extremely unpleasant affair."
"Very well," said the President. "You may make your closing arguments."
When Burdett did so, anyone listening would have been hard put to know if he was acting as prosecutor or defender, so gentle was his tone. Every charge was larded with caveats, each point he made qualified by doubts, so that when Piggott rose to make his address, the job had nearly been done for him.
"Sir, on the night in question, Captain Barclay entrusted a task to a young man who was not up to it. Yet this is the same young fellow who, within a week, would act on the enemy's shore in a way to shame the heroes of antiquity. In short, sir, what may seem overconfidence in the young man's abilities proved to be an underestimation of his qualities as a budding officer in the King's Navy. A blessing, given that more senior members of the crew were either lost or badly wounded."
Toby Burns, now sitting at the side of the court with Coyle, Kemp, Devereux and Gerson, had the good grace to blush, though he kept his eye fixed hard on the 5 judges and away from his aunt.
"So,"
Piggott continued,
"if Captain Barclay is guilty of anything, it is of placing too much trust in one so young. In the dark he could not know of the lad's errors of navigation, nor, since he did not himself enter the tavern called the Pelican, could he see if violence, which I am sure he expressly forbade, was being employed."
The long pause was for effect.
"It has been attested, under oath, that every man taken from that place volunteered, and it was only after time aboard John Pearce wished to reconsider, in fact to renege on his own freely given commitment. You have heard how he tried to suborn other members of the crew to also break their oath, causing so much trouble that Captain Barclay determined to get rid of him by sending him home on the first available ship. Sirs, you are all naval officers. I ask you, are these the actions of a man who had pressed men who were unwilling? No. It is the action of an upright officer who does not want aboard his vessel any man who does not truly want to serve his king and country."
Piggott walked over to stand beside his client.
"Captain Barclay is guilty."
That got a gasp from those too stupid to see where it was leading.
"But he is not guilty of illegal impressment. He broke the bounds of the liberties of the Savoy in error, not, as we have pointed out, his own. What did he find there? Why, men willing to serve, creatures whose life in such a place must have been hell on earth. He indeed would have been seen by many as a saviour. Testimony is plentiful that by the time the ship's boats raised Sheerness, even those who had had doubts were happy to accept the king's shilling. And then what? John Pearce, who you have heard most accurately described as a weather vane—"
He had to stop then. Emily Barclay, in standing, had noisily pushed back her chair. She glared at Piggott, then spun on her heel and marched out through a door opened for her by a servant. The President, who would have rigged the grating for any officer who had dared to do such a thing, could only offer a weak smile, seeming to be making an excuse for the gentler sex.
"A weather vane,"
Piggott intoned, picking up where he had left off.
"I will not rehearse again his actions. The court knows them only too well. He claims heroic status. Let him live with the knowledge, for he must know of what he did and what part others played in his good fortune. Suffice to say, that released from his bond by Captain Barclay, he could have no idea that another officer would come along and press him out of that merchant vessel. I ask the court to find Captain Barclay guilty, but of indulgence, kindness, understanding, and honourable behaviour.
Piggott stood rock-still for half a minute, then sat down. The President thanked him and Lieutenant Burdett, then asked that the room be cleared so that they could consider their verdict. Once outside, the Premier informed Barclay and both counsel that refreshments were awaiting them in the wardroom.
"Mr. Burns," said Ralph Barclay.
"Sir?"
"Back to the ship with you and the other witnesses. The boat may come back for me, and be so good as to ask Mr. Glaister to command it personally."
They drank well and ate better, for there was nothing more to do, and Burdett, no longer obliged even to pretend to prosecute, was fulsome in his praise of Barclay's actions, and convinced the court would see it that way. They were called back within half an hour, and faced their 5 judges, and as the President spoke, the eyes of the accused were on his sword, the point aimed at him, the sign of a guilty verdict.
"Captain Barclay, please rise. The court has considered carefully the evidence brought before it, and we feel a sense of deep disquiet that an officer of your experience should allow such a gross error of judgment to be permitted."
God, thought Ralph Barclay, I'm done for.
"However, taking into consideration all the facts, we find that there was no malice in your actions, that you saw yourself as acting in the best interests of the service. It is the judgment of this court that you should face a reprimand, and that no further action should be contemplated. That is the verdict we will pass to the Commander-in-Chief for confirmation."
"Might I inquire, sir," asked Piggott, "if you will see it as necessary to forward the case to a civil court?"
"We will not recommend such a course, but of course Lord Hood may see it differently. For now, Captain Barclay, you are free to return to your ship
and resume your duties."
Chapter 15. The Rock of Gibraltar was a welcome sight to any sailor, regardless of the direction from which it was approached, it being one of those points on a sea journey that denotes progress. Yet it was doubly so for a ship of the King's Navy, being a beacon of the nation's achievements, an outpost of British power that bearded the Spanish crown and made impossible any secret egress to the Atlantic Ocean by elements of the French Mediterranean fleet. Such a body of ships, combined with those based in the Atlantic ports, would, given the Royal Navy's commitments elsewhere, represent near parity of force, a threat to the shores of England that would be hard to contain. Wrested from Spain in 1702, following the Treaty of Utrecht, Gibraltar was the subject of an annual demand by the Spanish court for it to be returned, and just as often that request was denied. It was, quite simply, too valuable a strategic holding to be given up, quite apart from the fact that it had been taken by the effusion of much blood, and held through several sieges with a costly expenditure of that same commodity. There it stood, towering over the straits, 9 miles wide at the narrowest point, affording to anyone looking out from its pinnacle a good view of the African shore and the approaches from both west and east. It was a pity that the southeasterly that had given them such swift passage to the rock swung into the other direction, southwesterly, just a day before it was sighted. Digby, Pearce, and Neame now found themselves on deck all the time, as Faron and her chargers had to tack and wear towards their destination, working their way in a wind which carried with it fine sand, coating everything it touched.
"It is the prevailing wind this time of year, Mr. Pearce, and it do make life hard for a ship seeking to get out into the Atlantic."
Pearce was curious. He had come through the straits on the way out as easy as kiss my hand.
"How so?"
"Current set dead against it, flows through strong from the west." But surely, as with all currents, it sometimes reverses itself. Water must flow out of the Mediterranean as well as in.
You take no account of evaporation, sir, of which there is a deal in these warm climes, and it is reckoned by those who study it that there is a deep water current going out, and it is only the surface current coming in. So to make the outward passage you need a wind, and even then it ain't plain sailing. You wait and see.
And with the wind foul?
It's weather the southernmost point and get into Algeciras Bay, where we will lay till the wind changes in our favour.
Then Neame shouted, calling all hands to wear ship, before adding in a normal voice,
"Could be stuck for weeks at this time of year, and the bay is no joy, what with it being open to the southwesterly swell."
Pearce looked out at their chargers, the squadron of French 74s, wondering what the folk on the rock would make of the ships and their human cargo. That got him to thinking about being forced to lie up and wait for Neame's wind. They would have to do likewise, and that could create problems. Gibraltar was one of the few places where the rules regarding sailors going ashore were relaxed, quite simply because there was nowhere for them to run. The Spanish guarding the border at La Linea in a time of peace would clap them in jail before returning them. No British tar could be allowed to create dissension when they so badly wanted the rock back. In war, a more common circumstance between the two powers, the case did not arise. The only other option was a boat to the Mussulman shore, where anyone deserting the King's Navy could exchange life between decks for a life of rowing a Barbary galley, with a whip as encouragement. I don't suggest that the French sailors be allowed ashore, sir. Some of them would be bound to try the Spanish lines. But I wonder about the officers, if they gave us their parole. It would, after all, be a courtesy I think they would extend to us. Digby toyed with his wine-glass, keeping a firm grip on the stem to ensure that the contents stayed within the confines of the bowl, with the ship bucking about on a heavy sea. Pearce could see that he was possibly amenable to the idea, yet not wholly convinced. "I foresee a problem of perception, Mr. Pearce. We now know, because of contact, the men we have dealt with are not so different from ourselves." What a difference 8 days makes, Pearce thought. At the outset of their voyage, the men aboard those ships had been die-hard Jacobins to a man. Yet this is not an opinion vouchsafed to those in command at Gibraltar. It may be they already know of Lord Hood's plan, given the number of vessels bearing dispatches which pass through this station, in which case they will think of them as rabid dogs to be shot on sight should they snarl. I doubt the governor will take kindly to folk like that roaming his bailiwick. You and I could disabuse them of that notion, sir. Digby produced one of those throat-clearing coughs which were used to cover his embarrassment. He did not want to say that any recommendation from the likes of John Pearce would, if his name was known, likely have precisely the opposite effect to that sort. I have been told by Mr. Neame that Algeciras Bay is an uncomfortable anchorage on this wind. I will ask, Mr. Pearce, but I cannot say that I can guarantee acceptance. Strange things are said to happen to those stationed at the Rock. Something to do, I suppose, with the constrained nature of the posting. I've noticed it induces in them a level of hatred of the enemy that is exceptional in its vehemence. And when we are at war with Spain— Digby raised wonder-filled eyebrows to denote that the Rock's inhabitants, in those circumstances, became quite mad. Now, Mr. Pearce, I think it is time you and I returned to your numbers. It was Pearce's turn to inwardly groan. Digby had undertaken to help him with his geometry and the like, Mr. Neame, his previous tutor, being too busy on this wind, and he could not decline. Yet he knew very shortly he would answer some gently put inquiry like an idiot, and the feeling that induced would not be ameliorated by an understanding look in his captain's saddened eye. "Do you have any money, Michael?"
"A bit, which I got from that bastard Taberley for doing his bidding with my fists."
"Rufus?" The boy shook his head, and Charlie spoke before he was asked. "Not a pot to piss in, Pearce. Nor yet a window to throw it out of, Pearce added, finishing the mantra that Charlie Taverner was so fond of. He reached into his coat for his purse. Then I shall provide. My, Pearce! Exclaimed young Rufus, which had O'Hagan looking round to see, due to the lack of respect in that remark, that they were not being overheard. You are well found. It was money that he had been given to go ashore when Toulon was still in French hands, an advance from Hood's secret funds. Since no one had asked for it to be returned, and he had used so little, he now considered it no more than his due for that hazardous excursion. He tipped them 2 guineas each, amused at the way Charlie seemed able to palm it and make it disappear. But then he had been a sharp before being pressed, a man who lived off the gullible who flocked to London to see the sights. Rufus jingled the coins in his hand, leaving Pearce to wonder if he had ever held so much money before. Perhaps, as a bonded apprentice to a tight-purse master, he never had, and that was why he had run to the liberties. Michael O'Hagan just grinned. He would have seen such sums and more, being a highly rated man with a shovel in a world being everywhere dug up. Canals, foundations, drainage channels, and cellarage for new buildings, hewing for coal, and, the hardest task of all, a sinker of wells and mine shafts. Michael had done them all. What he had never managed to do, as far as Pearce could tell, was to hang on to what he earned. He was a man to whom it came easy, so he was a person to see it go easy as well. He worked to drink, and he drank or charmed a wench with his earnings, though he was inclined to turn contentious under the influence. Pearce could recall him that first night they had met, drunk, a bellowing bull who had tried to knock his block off, which had made him wonder if what he had just done was a good idea. "Don't get into trouble, any of you," Pearce insisted, articulating the concern. "Remember, I will be part of the authority forced to punish you if you do." "Sure, John boy," Michael said with a grin. "Would we be after embarrassing you?" Pearce returned the grin. "I bet you can't wait, Michael." Moreau and his fellow commanders had been through these straits before, and they required no orders to make a good southing so as to round Punta Europa. Pearce got a good idea of what Nîmes meant just by how long it took all 5 ships to tack and wear through the Narrows before they could give themselves enough sea room to put up their helms and clear into Algeciras Bay. The town after which that was named lay across the harbour from the rock, and even if there was peace, even if Spain was at this time an ally, there would be no traffic between the British and the Andalusians on mainland soil. The flags that flew on Gibraltar, which could be seen through a long glass from Algeciras, were like salt on an open wound. "It's a damn good thing that the Dons are with us, Pearce," said Digby. "I think if they were not, we would be unable to leave 5,000 sailors in view of temptation. We would have to anchor them right inshore and put a guard ship with loaded cannon on their weather beam." "Boat's ready, your honour," said Dysart, who was acting as Digby's coxswain. "Mr. Harbin to accompany me, Dysart." Then he turned to Pearce. "I will leave you to take young Fairmelow ashore, Pearce, after I have seen the Admiral. It will give you a chance to get to know him better, and perhaps lay some ghosts." That was the first time Digby had alluded to the fact that Fairmelow had been part of the press gang that had taken him up. Had he been watching them, his pelicans, himself and Fairmelow, and noted that even after he had been reassured, the boy still maintained a distance? On the one occasion Digby had invited the 2 mids to dine, the still bandaged Harbin, once having consumed a glass or 2, had been all volubility. Not Fairmelow. He had sipped quietly, spoken little, and stopped if he saw that Pearce wanted to speak. If Digby had spotted the reserve and discerned the reason without asking, he was showing an acute sense of atmosphere. "I know," Digby added, as Harbin ran to change into his best coat, "that this is a short commission, yet I sense the ship to be reasonably content. I would, if possible, have it fully so." "I will do my very best, sir." "I know you will, Mr. Pearce, for if I thought otherwise I would not have presumed to mention it." When can we give some shore time to the hands, sir?
When I have done my duty to the flag officer and have his permission.
Seeing the implied question in Pearce's reaction, he added, smiling,
Never fear, he will not withhold it. The tavern-keepers and whorehouse madams of the gut would have his intestines if he denied them their customers.
Then I look forward to taking Mr. Fairmelow ashore and showing him the sights.
For the sake of the Lord, Pearce, don't get the lad poxed.
Sorry to keep you waiting, sir, gasped Harbin, lifting his hat to show an ugly red scar.
You are keeping an admiral waiting, boy, not me.
The shock of Harbin's freckled face made Digby burst out laughing, and he patted him on the back as an encouragement to make for the gangway. Watching them go, Pearce thought it was indeed a happy ship, and the man responsible had just gone down into the cutter.
Disputes, sir. I fear disputes. I am plagued with them on this station, which I put down to the wind, which is not only constant, but can be hot like the hobs of hell one day and like Arctic ice the next.
Admiral Hartley, I agree with you about guard boats for the crews. I merely asked that the French commissioned officers be allowed some freedom.
Oh, I would gift it to them, man. But I can tell you that in an instant they would be atop the rock at dawn, facing some bad-tempered bullock. You have no idea what service on jib does for soldiers. They're a damn nuisance in any case, but stationed here brings out their very worst traits. I swear the apes behave better.
If we were to provide escorts, sir. Hartley was a fat little fellow, a perfect officer for a shore appointment, and probably damned glad to have it, given the only other option was a yellow flag and enforced retirement. As a sea-going officer, he had struggled to gain respect, yet he had interest, the kind of connections that kept him from mouldering in the country, or shrinking and losing money at the baths and card tables of some spa. Right now he was rubbing one of his several chins, and musing on what had been proposed.
Do you have a commitment to get every one of these rogues to Biscay?
The implication of that question was obvious.
If one of them got speared or struck down by a musket ball,
would Hartley suffer for it?
Not as individuals, sir.
Officers with officers?
I think we could do even better than that, sir. An officer and a chosen party of hands as escorts should keep them from mischief.
Very well, Digby. But ration them their time ashore, and make sure if the wind shifts they are not lost in the arms of some trollop. I want them out of my command as soon as possible.
Pearce came on deck as soon as Fairmelow informed him that Farron's cutter had put off from the shore, so it was only idle curiosity that had him looking to the west, when he sighted the familiar rig of a ship he knew well, the postal packet Lorne, and if that was the case, it was almost certain that her Ulster-born captain, Mr. McGann, was conning her at that very moment. Such a sight lifted his spirits, not that he was in any way down, but McGann was a man he esteemed, a fine sailor loved by his family of a crew, who had shown him a degree of kindness on the way out from Portsmouth to the Mediterranean that had made a task, which he saw as a duty, a pleasure.
"Mr. Fairmelow," he said, pointing due west, "I am terribly tempted to give that ship opening the bay a gun."
The youngster was slow to respond, as he always was with Pearce, but finally curiosity got the better of him, and he looked at it through a glass. "Why, sir, it is naught but a postal packet by its ensign."
"I know the captain and the crew, and they will be ashore at the same time as you and I, so I can look forward to making an introduction."
He looked over his shoulder to see the cutter closing, and gave orders for the gangway to be opened and everyone to be ready to receive, with due ceremony, the captain aboard.
"How went it, sir?" he asked of Digby once their salutes were complete. "Well, Pearce, very well."
"The Admiral said yes?"
"With qualifications. The French must be escorted at all times, and I have said it will be officers and a party of hands. But best of all, Pearce, he has granted me permission to sleep out of the ship. It is a dangerous thing for a sailor to say, but I long for a night in a motionless cot."
McGann was not hard to find. The run of taverns that made up the Gut were crowded with sailors from all the ships stuck for a westerly passage, plus the army, though the officers and ranks of the garrison tended to favour different venues, and the odd local, who were Spanish in the main but prepared to deny that for profit. The captain of the Lawn was well on his way to being drunk, with that glassy-eyed look and hint of a sway that Pearce recognised. Yet the smile was the same, drunk or sober, and when he saw Pearce, his arms went out, thumping inadvertently another customer round the ear, and in a trice he had his much taller friend in a crushing embrace.
"Mr. Pearce, sir, can I tell you how happy I am to see you, sir? What good fortune attends!"
Pearce looked over McGann's shoulder and greeted the members of his crew, all of whom had been kind to him, as McGann shouted for more drink, this while one of his men sought to pacify the man who had been clouted. Having with some effort detached himself, Pearce introduced his companions. "May I name to you first Lieutenant de Vaisseau Gerard Moreau, who I regret to say speaks no English."
"Pas de problème, mon ami,"
exclaimed McGann, taking and pumping Moreau's hand.
"Voulez-vous prendre un boire avec moi?"
"Mon plaisir, monsieur." This, Pearce interrupted, albeit he was amused by McGann's less than perfect French, "is Midshipman Fairmelow, like me, of HMS Farron."
"Young man,"
exclaimed McGann in a voice that carried and bounced off the smoke-blackened walls,
"you too will drink with me.
And
say no more, Mr. Pearce, until you have a tankard in your hand."
That did not take long, McGann being a well-known customer. Lorne ran the mails and official dispatches between England and Gibraltar on a regular basis. The people who owned this tavern knew his shout and knew how to serve him. Everyone within close proximity was handed a drink, including the total stranger he had accidentally buffeted, which mollified the man more than the apologies of McGann's crew.
"You will recall me telling you about the men I was pressed with,"
Pearce said, his voice raised to cover the din of drinking salutation.
"I am happy to say I have them here with me. John Pearce, you have achieved your object."
"Not quite, but I want you to meet my pelicans." Each got a hearty shake. McGann, who was a short fellow, looked like a dwarf beside Michael, and though Pearce sought to explain what had actually happened as opposed to that which McGann supposed, he had a strong feeling not a word penetrated. Pearce looked at Moreau, who was laughing, not at the little Ulsterman, but because of him.
"Un homme très amusant, Monsieur Pearce, je pense."
Funny, yes, thought Pearce, but he could be trouble also, having a fatal flaw when in drink of assuming that every woman he met was madly in love with him, a fact he would act upon, even if their escort or the husband was standing right next to them. He was a gifted fellow at sea, and an absolute menace ashore, something Pearce had had occasion to witness and confirm, which had him wondering what the combination would be of that man drunk as well as Michael O'Hagan. It did not bear thinking about. McGann was in deep conversation with Moreau now, while Michael, Charlie, and Rufus had been taken up by the crew of the Lawn, which left Pearce with a rather stiff Fairmelow. "I wish I could persuade you to relax, young man. I've already told you I bear you no malice, yet I fear you do not quite believe me." "I do, sir." Right then, Pearce resolved to get the boy drunk. Perhaps then whatever fears he was harbouring would emerge. He had just put his tankard to his lips after signalling to the innkeeper for a round of refills, when a loud and peremptory voice interrupted him.
"There, sir! You, sir!"
Pearce turned slowly to look into the red and furious face of an army officer, using his elbows to make his way through the crowd. There was something about him that was familiar, but Pearce could not place why it should be so.
"I see by your countenance, sir, that you do not recall me."
"I do not." Pearce looked at the insignia, unsure of the rank. The man's hand swung, and though Pearce ducked away, it still caught him a glancing blow on the cheek, and all he could hear was the voice shouting,
"Perhaps, sir, that will refresh your memory, you damn coward."
Pearce moved fast, just ahead of Michael O'Hagan, who looked set to flatten the soldier. For him to strike an officer would be tantamount to a capital crime. Not that Michael would hesitate because of such reasoning. Instead, Pearce's hand shot out open-palmed and caught the redcoat under the chin, sending him reeling back into the arms of a group of fellow soldiers who had obviously followed him across the room. Suddenly there were two groups, those not party to what was obviously going to be a brawl, moving away.
"You do not run this time, sir," shouted his assailant. "Perhaps you have learnt not to be shy since we last met."
Pearce recognised him now. On his last visit to Gibraltar, in the company of Captain McGann, he had been obliged to strike this fellow. Not that the redcoat was entirely at fault. McGann had been making advances to his wife, a voluptuous-looking creature with an ample bosom, who really should not have been in a place of such low repute. In seeking to apologise on McGann's behalf, he had been himself insulted, and the Major's continued refusal to accept it as an error had sparked Pearce into an action he had later regretted. He had punched the sod. A general melee followed, involving the officers of the ship that was to take him to meet Lord Hood, but he had been hustled away. With orders to weigh, there was no time for the duel which was bound to follow.
"Well, sir, what do you say? I have administered a blow. Are you going to run again, or is your plan this time to set a bunch of ruffians on me? Do so if you dare. I have my friends to aid me, and when all is ended, I will still demand satisfaction."
Pearce was still restraining Michael, who, looking at the line of redcoat officers, hissed, "Let me be, John boy. I'll crease the lot of them." That was when McGann stepped in front of both Michael and Pearce.
"You, sir, I demand your name." "And who, sir, are you?" "I am the author of this sorry affair, the man who, I'm told, insulted your wife. It was to defend me that this fellow struck you a blow."
His crew must have told him. Inebriated as he had been, there was no way McGann would have remembered.
"It matters not. The blow was struck. Satisfaction is required." "Several blows have been struck, sir," McGann slurred, "but I am responsible. If you wish for satisfaction, you must take it from me." "Wait your turn, dwarf."
McGann, more steady than Pearce thought him capable of, walked straight up to the Major and slapped his cheek.
"I will not wait, sir. I will be first, and I ask you to name your weapon."
"Pistols!" the Major barked, then turned to another officer and named him as his second. Pearce saw, out of the corner of his eye, the crew of the Lawn nodding. Was it relief?
"Mr. Pearce will be mine." "Good. When I've seen to you, he can be next. Until dawn tomorrow." "Fernando!" McGann shouted as the Major stomped away. "Our tankards are empty."
Chapter 16. They had to be up before dawn, and with Digby sleeping ashore, Pearce could leave the ship without having to explain his destination. He had with him the surgeon Lutyens to see to the wounded, and a sword he fully intended to use. As the man struck, he had the choice, because despite McGann's protestations of the previous night, which he repeated ad nauseam, that he had no worries about this coming event, there was no way a man as drunk as he had been could face up at the crack of dawn to an opponent versed in the use of arms. Pearce intended to force him to step aside, and it was therefore something of a shock to observe, when they met on the dockside, that the captain of the Lawn seemed to be in fine fettle.
"I never suffer from the effect of drink of a morning, John, which I put down to a fine Irish constitution."
Introduced to Lutyens, they fell to discussing the seat of the heavy drinker's problem, which was held to be the liver, and gout afflicting the big toe, with the surgeon talking of the dissections he had performed on victims of everything from an excess of gin to the occasional cadaver fallen to the perils of overindulgence in claret. His opinion that the former was 10 times more insidious than the latter, owing to the low quality of the brew. "Though I have to say, Captain, that the gin drinker is the article more often to be found on the cutting table for another reason.
they being more likely to suffer a pauper's death than a man addicted to wine.
"The heart, sir! You must have seen the heart!"
demanded McGann, in an exercise in morbidity that Pearce found strange, given where they were heading.
"And that I do very much envy you."
"Sir, I have seen it in its working mode on more than one occasion, and it is, the first time you set eyes on it, the most amazing sight."
"Tell me more."
Given an audience, Lutyens responded, and was soon explaining what he had seen of kidneys, muscles, genitals of both sexes, the route of bodily waste through the gut to the fundament, in such detail that Pearce dropped back to be out of earshot. He had not thought himself squeamish, but such a precise description of the human innards was not to be borne before a man had consumed a hearty breakfast. 1 cup of coffee was insufficient. It had left his stomach to rumble, a necessary condition, it being held inadvisable for a participator to eat before a duel.
"Mr. McGann seems in a jolly mood."
"Same as ever, our captain," replied the crewman McGann had fetched along. "He don't change much, as you will have noted." "Indeed I have," Pearce replied. McGann drank little or nothing at sea, saving his immoderation for the shore. He, too, had a happy ship, and like Henry Digby, he was the cause, with a care for his crew that bordered on the fatherly. Ever smiling, his orders always soft and supplicant, not harsh. Yet I fear for him this day. The man slapped his hand on the polished box he carried, which had to contain a pair of pistols. "I should fear for the man he slapped." That was surely unusual behaviour for the captain. I observed him drunk on our last meeting, but he showed no hint of a violent temperament. The sailor just smiled, and there was no time to elicit any more information as, puffing from the steep climb, they reached an open space near the top of the rock, chasing away the apes that occupied the heights. Looking east, they saw that the sky was tinged with grey, and their ears told them the military party was approaching on horseback. Lutyens and McGann were still deep in conversation, and the sailor was rubbing one shoulder as though it was causing him some pain. Courtesy is the absolute requirement of duelling. Whatever the offence waiting to be settled, everyone has to behave like a gentleman. Thus polite greetings were exchanged by those not the principals, and introductions carried out, and Pearce received with grace the invitation from Major Lipton's second that an apology be offered. This, despite Pearce's pleading, McGann flatly refused to accept. "Then let me fight him first with swords. I have trained with some of the finest fencing masters in Paris, and if it smacks of showing away, I am good with a blade. I fancy that, soldier or no, I can best him in that department, and if I can, you will not have to contest your dispute with him at all." McGann looked up at him with a belligerent expression.
"If you were the John Pearce with whom I sailed not 2 months past, you would not be seeking to kill the fellow, regardless of his bellicosity."
"Of course not. I would seek a satisfactory wound, one that satisfied his honour and my own."
"And then what happens? This Lipton is stationed here, and I am a regular caller at the Rock, as my duty demands. I dare say he would wait till your wound healed, and still demand that I meet him. Best then to get it over with now."
"You are determined, then?"
"I am."
"Then I hope your opponent has the same attitude you ascribe to me."
"Pearce, I bet you a breakfast that I will eat mine with my own hand, but yonder major will need to be spoon-fed. Now, please be so good as to ask if the fellow will examine my pistols, which, if he has no objection, I would prefer to use."
That had Pearce consulting with Lipton's second again. He looked at the army pistols, a rather scarred pair of ordinary weapons in a well-travelled box. McGann's were as different as chalk and cheese, a beautiful pair of Lobies with the fine inlay and beautiful craftsmanship for which the Dublin gunmaker was famous. "If you wish for accuracy and balance, sir," Lipton's second said as he held one in his hand, "I doubt ours would match the captain's."
"Very well," growled the major, removing his coat. "One ball does as much damage as another."
"Then Mr. Pearce and I will load them." There was another officer along with the military party,
in a heavy cloak which kept hidden his rank, and a low hat that did much to disguise his features, no name being given as he stepped forward and supervised the loading. This as a red sun hit the horizon.
"We will wait till it is full up, gentlemen," he growled. "I would not have it implied that anyone lacked advantage from a want of light."
It only took minutes till the sun was a rising red-gold ball. With neither man facing the light, they stood back to back in shirts and breeches only, this while Lutyens squatted by his medical case, taking out various articles and laying them out ready for use, and working on some bandages for the expected wound. From under his cloak the unknown officer produced a pistol of his own, primed and loaded, the reason for his person remaining anonymous emphasized in his next words.
"The rules you know, gentlemen. 10 paces, then turn, as I count them out. Anyone seeking to best their opponent before that, I will shoot. On 10 you may turn and fire at your own convenience. Should no shot strike either party, I will call upon you to agree a conclusion, or invite you to load again."
The fellow, who could be had up for murder if he carried out his threat to shoot, had the voice for the count, deep and sonorous, and being garbed like the Grim Reaper gave him authority. McGann and Lipton moved, pace by pace, away from each other in slow, measured steps. On the count of 10, Pearce wanted to close his eyes, and his hand was gripping the hilt of his sword so much it hurt. Both men spun, the Major pushing one leg back to get proper balance so as to aim properly. McGann did not bother with such refinements. He fired as soon as he saw his target, and Lipton spun away, taken at the top of his shooting arm, which was sent sideways, his weapon discharged in the process, the ball fired harmlessly into the ground.
"I think you will find, Pearce," McGann called. "The Major will not be looking for satisfaction from you this day."
Lutyens was already by the wounded soldier, easing him into a sitting position and tearing at his shirt to get at the wound, a probe already in his hand. Lipton's second was dosing his pallid principal with brandy, this before he put the leather strap the surgeon had handed him between his teeth. The way the wounded officer took the treatment was admirable. The man was no screaming milksop. He sat, looking over Lutyens' shoulder as the surgeon probed with the lack of finesse for which he was known, and winced only when he found the musket ball, ignoring the copious blood that flowed from the wound. The cloaked adjudicator stood over the scene, and inquired as to whether his companion would be in need of a hospital. "No," Lutyens replied, finally extracting the ball with a long set of tweezers. He then produced what he liked to call his magic formula, a German preparation called Melissengeist, and pouring that onto a linen pad, he set to staunching the flow of blood. "Pearce, fetch me that bandage I have laid out, and the other I have already fashioned into a sling." The sun was up, bright gold and high by the time he had bound the wound and got the Major back onto his feet, the man unsteady but determined. "He will have to walk down, he cannot ride." "That is our responsibility," said his second. He looked over to where McGann stood, well away from the ministrations, and added, "The matter is of course settled. Gentlemen, I thank you for your attendance, and you, Mr. Lutyens, for the attention you have given to my superior." The fellow in the cloak and his second either side of him, they led Major Lipton from the field, he hunched over in pain, as Pearce said, "You were well prepared, Heinrich, were you not? A sling already fashioned?" Lutyens looked at Pearce and smiled, his thin hair blowing in the increasing breeze, his face alight with humour. "Captain McGann told me to get it prepared. In fact, he told me the exact spot in which he was going to wound the fellow, the arm he would need to wield his sword. He laughed when he told me how you underestimated him. It seems that the good captain is a marksman of some repute." It was a week before they got their wind, with nights spent ashore in the company of the French officers. The captains were 4 very different men. Garnier, of wiry build and pale complexion, was less given to good humour than Moreau, but he was a very pleasant fellow, a well-read man who could hold a decent conversation, who also confessed liking to paint a little when ashore. Jacquelin was taciturn and not happy to share wine and food with folk he still saw as the enemy, which made being in his company hard going. Forcé of the entrepreneur was a fool, and uncouth with it, a man who would never have achieved any commissioned rank in royal service, and he gave the impression, as he damned the Jacobins, that he was as like to damn what went before, and still save some bile for what might follow. He ate as though tomorrow was bound for famine, drank like a fish, and became both coarse and incomprehensible when drunk, singing raucous and filthy songs which denigrated British manhood. This, as the crew from the Farron were obliged to row him back to his vessel.
"I dinna ken what he was warbling about, your honour," said Dysart, "but I can tell by the looks it wasn't a sweet talk."
"I will not translate, Dysart," Pearce replied. "We may well have to transport the fellow again, and I know you will look for an opportunity to drown him if you understand his sentiments." Coming alongside the ships, he was faced with the other junior officers, none of whom had been allowed to go ashore on that night, but people with whom Pearce had shared bread and wine. Not that they had failed to enjoy some evening entertainment if they were stuck aboard. Ever since they dropped anchor, the 4 ships had been surrounded by boats, some from Gibraltar, others all the way from Algeciras, selling everything they could possibly want, including women. The guard boats, provided by Admiral Hartley, did nothing to interfere in this trade, but they did seek to count the numbers allowed close, so that no Frenchman could run when the boats pulled for the shore. Eventually the wind swung round, cannons were fired as signals, and the shipping in the bay became a hive of activity as they prepared to get under way. Digby waited until a whole host of merchant vessels had cleared the anchorage before signalling himself, hauling HMS Farron over her anchor and leading the way out past the western arm of Algeciras Bay. It was necessary to hug the Spanish shore, the Atlantic current being strongest in mid-channel and weaker by the land. Yet even with a wind they made slow progress, inching along. At one point the current won out marginally over the wind, which had the boats out hauling the ships along. It seemed a blessing that it sprung up again before they passed the cliff-top town of Tarifa. "Look there, Pearce, at that damned fortress." It needed no real indication from Digby to see the stone towers, dominating as they did the inshore waters, the muzzles of cannon very obvious in the wall embrasures. "I would not risk being this close in if we were fighting the Dons, I can tell you." "Means waiting for a good blow," added Neame. "This puff would never serve if we was at war." "And it's every man on deck," Digby said. "Guns run out and nets rigged in case the Spaniards send out gunboats or a capital ship from the bay." "What happens if the wind shifts again, Mr. Neame?"
"Then you put up your helm, Mr. Pearce, and run back for the safety of the rock, 'cause the next thing on your larboard beam is Cadiz, home port to half the Spanish fleet."
Things improved as they weathered Cape Trafalgar, the current easing as it became less intense, and Neame was able to alter course to take the squadron out into the deep Atlantic. He wanted sea room, not a lee shore, in case the wind did shift again, and soon they were leaving land behind, rising and falling on the Atlantic rollers that beat upon the rocky shore over the stern.
"You know the Bay of Biscay, sir?"
asked Neame over a dinner in Digby's cabin. Lutyens was again present, but his face went blank at the mention of anything nautical.
"A foul place in the main."
"I sailed through it on the Lawn, and though Captain McGann told me of the reputation of the bay, it was a mill-pond on that occasion." "Pray for something similar, Pearce, for it is a bad time of year to be around this part of the ocean. The southwesterlies of the autumnal equinox can be vicious." "Is that not the wind we seek?" "I was thinking of getting out of the bay, Mr. Pearce, for getting in on this wind is easy." Digby paused, then looked around the table in a way that commanded attention. "I have waited till we cleared the straits before bringing up the subject of our destination."
"I had it as Rochefort, followed by Lorient, sir," said Neame. "That is what I have marked out as our course."
"Those are the official orders?" Pearce interjected. He knew the tone of his captain's voice.
"Which you clearly do not regard as binding."
That's sharp, Pearce, since I have yet to give an opinion. There would be little need to mention it if you intended to just comply, sir. I say this in confidence. Lord Hood's last words to me were a hint, no more, that such ports might not be the best choice, and the act of gifting the French Navy 4 seaworthy ships was not one to cheer him or to ease his mind. There are few others that could take ships of that draught, said Neame. Digby leant forward. We have already mentioned the seasonal gales that afflict the Biscay shore. If we run into such weather on our way back to the Straits, we will be lucky to make any progress. Indeed, we may have to run for deep water. If we gets the chance, Your Honour, Neame interrupted with a gloomy expression. Well put, Mr. Neame. The whole bay is a lee shore at this time of year, with few places of shelter that do not represent an even greater risk. In strict obedience of my written instructions, I am to see our chargers weather the Ile d'Oléron, allow Patriot and Entreprenant to detach for Rochefort, and let the other pairs set a course north for Lorient, it being left to me whether I continue to escort them. What would you rather do, sir? Asked Pearce. Or should I say, what would Lord Hood have you do? I have no precise instructions, so let us look at the choices. I take it you would agree that gifting the enemy a squadron of 74-gun ships of the line is not a good idea. Both men nodded. So can we take them to another port that will render them unusable? Bordeaux has the depth of water, and has the advantage it is not a naval station, therefore unlikely to have the armaments necessary to re-equip the enemy vessels. Neame looked disquieted. "'Tis a long way upriver, sir, and the wind you speak of could keep us in the Gironde for weeks." The master did not say that the French officers would be as reluctant to sail up to Bordeaux port for the same reason. They could be stuck there till spring. Which is why I have discarded the notion. Likewise Nantes. I would point out to you, then, what I have just said about a lee shore. If that is a threat to us for sailing in too far, then it is even more of that to a ship anchored in unprotected waters. I propose, therefore, to lead our chargers to anchor off La Rochelle. Pearce shrugged. He had heard of the place. No student of any history involving France could not know of it, given it was the last stronghold of the Protestant religion in the time of Cardinal Richelieu, and besieged because of it. But that was the limit of his knowledge. Mr. Neame, please confirm my thinking. Could a 74 be warped into La Rochelle harbour? I'd have to consult my charts, sir, but I have a strong feeling it ain't been used for capital ships since the time of the 14th Louis. And that has more to do with the depth of water under the keel than the layout of the harbour. 74s would probably ground well before they reached. Given it is a port, and its position, if it could be used, it would be. It's more a slaver's home now. That and sugar, of course, notwithstanding most of that fetches up in Nantes. I think you are forgetting privateers, Mr. Neame. Oh, them also, of course. So if our chargers were anchored there at this time of year, no French captain would think of such a thing, Your Honour. It will be asking for trouble. Without the crews needed to get them clear? Lutyens eventually spoke up. Would someone explain to me what you are talking about? With pleasure, Mr. Lutyens, Digby replied. We shall bypass Rochefort and the mouth of the Charente and sail on to La Rochelle. There we will land the crews of all 4 vessels and hope for a rapid change in the weather, namely the onset of the autumn gales that plague the Biscay coast. Given warning of that, we will immediately put to sea and leave the French ships in a situation where it is very possible, with nothing rigged to get to sea, they will be driven onto the shore and destroyed. We will therefore have completed our task and kept Lord Hood's commitment, having landed the French radicals on their own soil in their own part of the world. But we will not have gifted our enemies 4 sound vessels that only require their cannon to be replaced to become as formidable as they were originally. How does that strike you, Mr. Lutyens? As dishonest, Lutyens replied with a sparkle in his eye. He waited till Digby looked aggrieved before adding, but very clever. Pearce cut in.
I admit to not speaking from any knowledge, but is not the weather a fickle instrument on which to base a strategy? It could be some time before the elements oblige." Digby nodded. "Then we will be in a bind, Mr. Pearce, for I cannot believe our presence will go unnoticed. I would expect a warship, very possibly a frigate, to be sent from Rochefort to seek us out, which we cannot fight with any hope of success." Digby brightened, but there was a gallows quality to his humour. "There is always hope, Lieutenant Pearce, whatever the odds." "I merely ask, sir, because a certain contingency has to be covered." "Namely," Digby replied, "that we have to weigh in haste, and the crews ashore immediately return to their ships, or at least enough of them to raise sail." "Is that not why we fetched along the carronades, sir?" said Pearce. "The prospect of breaking a given commitment does not bother you, sir, I see." The glint in Digby's eye took the sting out of what could have been construed as base thinking, and Pearce realized what he had been about. The captain had reached the very same conclusion they were at now, but in having this discussion he had brought them all to a like assessment. Questioned later, he could rightly claim it was not his orders that made his inferiors act as they did, but their own inclinations. "Let us say, sir, that I am thinking like our enemy would think." "I, too, have put myself in that position, Mr. Pearce, and rest assured, when I state they shall not have those ships, I mean what I say. I'll burn them to the waterline before I give them over." The eyes had become like flints, a measure of Digby's determination. "Not a word of this outside these cabin walls, and this discussion was never held. We need to get our Frenchmen aboard and oblige them to accede to our intentions." Chapter 17.
"I would remind you, madam, that we are at war, and that I have duties to perform that are consistent with my rank and obligations. I cannot do so if I am under a cloud of accusation from the likes of that scoundrel Pearce."
Ralph Berkeley was deliberately loud in his discourse. Having decided to fight back, he knew that he must force his wife into the kind of submission that alone would grant them the prospect of a happy future. The expectation of her behaviour continuing unchecked was not to be borne, and he actually slapped the table as he added, "What was done was necessary." Emily replied in a meek voice, "But was it true, husband?"
"It was as true as it needed to be. Every officer who sat on that court has found himself at some time in the same boat as I. The nation needs sailors to man its ships, and if not enough come forward, what are we to do? It is not a pleasant task, but it is a necessary one. If we are to be threatened every time someone feels aggrieved, we might as well send the French an invite to invade England and march their rabble down Whitehall."
For the first time since the subject had been broached, she looked up at him. "I rather had the impression you took pleasure from it. Pressing the men to serve at sea, I mean."
"My dear," he insisted, "I hate it, but Hood left me no choice. I asked him, indeed begged him for hands, which he had in abundance sitting on their backsides at the Tower. Did he put the needs of his country before everything? No, he did not. He put his own requirements first. I could do no other than take that as an example. If you do not accept such an explanation, then seek the opinions of my fellow officers. You can try Admiral Hotham if you like. He has asked us to dine aboard Britannia tonight."
Emily looked alarmed. The notion of a formal naval dinner was not a pleasant one. "Could I not plead an indisposition?" The table got another slap.
"No, madam, you cannot. Anyone with enough spirit to get from ship to shore by themselves in a bought wherry can hardly plead ill health 24 hours later. And while we are on the subject, I will not have you defy me again. You put Gloucester in an impossible position, and that also will never happen again. Do I make myself clear?"
"You do, husband. But now I wonder if it would have been better had I not sailed with you in the first place. Better if I had stayed at home."
"Mrs. Berkeley!"
Emily looked directly at him, which stopped him speaking, well aware of what was going on. He was her husband, she his wife, Socially, legally, and in the eyes of God, she was bound to obey him. But that did not mean she was denied an opinion. "I mean only that I have seen a side of you that would have remained hidden had I not come aboard this ship. And do not think I am unaware that we live in a less than perfect world. Do not suppose that I assume that what pertains on land must of necessity be any easier at sea. But something being necessary does not of itself make it right."
"I did not set out to disappoint you, madam."
"I know that, Captain Barclay," Emily replied, in a tone of voice that left him in no doubt that was precisely what he had done.
"Please be so good as to see that my best uniform is ready for this evening."
Emily replied, "Of course," with the sure knowledge the task given was one normally performed by Shenton. Her husband was asserting his will in an area which it would be churlish of her to decline. 2 people overheard the exchange. The closest, Shenton, was pleased by it. His job had just got easier, and who knows, he thought, the captain might send his bitch home. The second was seeing it in exactly the opposite light. A husband having trouble with his wife was, to Cornelius Gerson, like pitch-perfect music.